My name is Omer Fischer. I'm the head of the Human Rights Department. It will be my pleasure to moderate this session. This working session 11 is dedicated to humanitarian issues and other commitments, combating trafficking in human beings, refugees and displaced persons, and persons at risk of displacement. I will not now go through the annotated agenda, but just a reminder of the questions we may wish to address during the working session. They include how are states monitoring and addressing the effectiveness of national referral mechanisms, and which parameters and indicators are used, and what are the key findings in this regard. What are the best practices in participating states which have resulted in the improvement of coordination and increasing of successful prosecutions, as well as reintegration and rehabilitation of victims of trafficking in human beings? How can national referral mechanisms be made more effective in strengthening prevention efforts in a multidisciplinary context? How are anti-trafficking measures correlated with or integrating into other policy areas? For example, on labor migration, gender equality, employment, education, social protection of vulnerable groups of population, especially children without parental care, migrant children, and other disadvantaged groups. How, in the current context, can participating states improve reception conditions and better address the needs of vulnerable groups in national asylum procedures, as well as effectively utilize the asylum procedures to identify their vulnerabilities? What good practices exist with regard to measures on the national level to prevent and avoid conditions that might lead to displacement? And in the context of conflicts in the OSCE area, which persons are in particular at risk to be displaced, and how to pay specific attention to persons residing in conflict contexts? These are some of the questions that we may wish or may be able to address during the working session, but it is not an exclusive list, and of course other issues and other questions may well be addressed during this session, as long as we remain within the topic of the session. And I will try and do my best to remind all of you speakers and participants of the topic at hand, should there be any interventions that may not fall under these topics. The colleagues behind me are maintaining our speakers list at the back of this table. If the list is still open, there are still some slots available for any of you who would like to take the floor. And if you would like to do so, please indicate that to my colleagues. We have a limit of 50 participants that can speak per working session, which will apply also during this session. Please, a reminder that speakers can only take the floor in the capacity in which they are registered, and only entities registered on the speakers list can be represented. Due to the layout, the narrow layout of the plenary hall, to facilitate entrance, we have introduced separate doors for participants corresponding to their designated seats. You are all kindly requested to use your designated entrance. And as always, seats in the plenary hall are designated, as indicated on signs placed around the table. Again, you're kindly asked to respect this seating arrangement. All participants are also kindly reminded to familiarize themselves with rules for filming in the plenary hall, as indicated in the General Information and Organizational Modalities document available on the HDIM webpage. Live streaming of the 2017 Human Dimension Implementation meeting is available. Filming with cameras and video cameras is only permitted by accredited journalists. No other audiovisual recordings should be undertaken without the explicit permission of individuals being filmed. As always, a kind reminder that interventions are expected to be presented in a meaningful, orderly, and respectful manner. And finally, my final reminder, we kindly ask participants to submit statements before now or whenever available to the interpreters, and preferably to our colleagues in document distribution, to ensure that the flow of documents reflects a discussion, and the statements should be provided to the documentation desk in front of the plenary hall. With all this I conclude my series of reminders, and I'm now moving to introducing our two distinguished speakers for this session. The first is Ambassador Madina Jarbusinova. Ambassador Madina Jarbusinova of Kazakhstan is the OSCE Special Representative and Coordinator for combating trafficking in human beings and represents the OSCE at a political level in anti-trafficking issues. She took office in September 2014. From June 2012 to August 2014, she served as the OSCE Project Coordinator in Ukraine. She was Ambassador at Large for Kazakhstan from 2009 to 2011, including during Kazakhstan's chair-in office in 2010. Previously, since 2008, she represented the countries of Central and Eastern Europe and the Commonwealth of Independent States at the SOS Kinderdorf International Senate in Vienna. She also previously was a member of the United Nations Development Fund for Women, UNIFEM, Advisory Board, and a member of the UN Commission on Sustainable Development Board. From 1999 to 2003, she was her country's permanent representative at the United Nations, and prior to this, between 1998 and 1999, she served as Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Kazakhstan. Ambassador Jarbusinova, you have the floor.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants, Excellencies, it's a privilege for me to open this discussion of the annual Human Dimension Implementation meeting, a platform which continues to serve as a major OSCE monitoring and reporting instrument. And I would like to begin by taking this opportunity to congratulate ODIHR's new director, Mrs. Ingeborg Gisladottir, upon her appointment, and I look forward to enhanced and fruitful cooperation between our offices. Dear colleagues, for many years OSCE has been recognized as a thought leader for its innovative work on human trafficking, and I'm proud that our organization continues to be a pioneer in advocating a human rights and victim-centered approach to countering trafficking in human beings. Developed by ODIHR and predominantly defined in 2003 action plan and its addendums through the national referral mechanisms, these approaches remain fundamental for effective victim protection and criminal justice responses. As such, they are justifiably reflected and integrated across many national laws and major regional instruments. However, despite the success of this widespread integration, shortcomings remain, and it is thus perhaps timely that a variety of international organizations are currently working upon improving these mechanisms. In 2015, I myself commissioned a survey to obtain an overview of the status of implemented of selected anti-trafficking commitments across the OSCE region. The analysis of the survey's findings, together with meetings organized by my office this year, including the 17th Alliance Against Trafficking in Persons Conference on Trafficking in Children and the Best Interest of the Child, and the meeting of the National Anti-Trafficking coordinators and rapporteurs, demonstrate that significant progress has been made by the OSCE participating states in tackling human trafficking. Nevertheless, these events, as well as my country visits, indicate that proper implementation of OSCE anti-trafficking commitments is still lacking. Anti-trafficking stakeholders are facing many major challenges in the practical implementation of their national laws and policies, in particular in the current crisis context. Clearly, much remains to be done to ensure an adequate response to the trafficking of human beings and protection of its victims. However, without strengthening the implementation of national tools and facilitating cooperation at the local, national, and international levels, human trafficking will inevitably remain on an upward trend, exacerbated by poor identification and prosecution, weak provision of assistance to victims, and lack of efficient cooperation between state authorities and non-governmental organizations, the main services providers in our region. Of further cause for concern is the reality that perpetrator prosecution remains unsatisfactory and the rate of conviction of traffickers is continuously extremely low. Today, I therefore reiterate my call for all relevant stakeholders to ensure regular communication and information exchange between anti-trafficking actors, including civil society organizations in countries of origin, transit, and destination, and to promote proactive and human rights compliant criminal justice responses. With regard to trafficking in children, the 2017 Alliance Conference highlighted the need to better coordinate governmental efforts to protect children, yet I may equally add the same also applies to adults. Demographics aside, the importance of maintaining equal focus across the four pillars of prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnership was also underlined by a range of relevant stakeholders as being crucial to effectively and comprehensively responding to trafficking in human beings. Enhancing the capacity of frontline operators to identify and refer potential and real victims of trafficking, in particular in situations of mixed migration, and strengthening the cooperation of frontline actors to more effectively identify and protect trafficked persons and unaccompanied minors remain of paramount importance. This is why in the past year I visited several temporary protection and first reception centers across the OC region, Gaziantep, Lampedusa, this year Athens, Lesbos, and elsewhere. These visits have proven key to examining the progress made by relevant authorities in identifying and assisting potential THB victims along the current migration routes. These findings were also developed by us into the project we've been implementing on prevention of trafficking along migration routes, the simulation-based program where we try to encourage our participants to understand that multi-agency, multi-stakeholder approach, of course, human rights-based approach is crucial for more efficient fight against trafficking in human beings, against traffickers. To summarize the findings of the visits which I've mentioned, my office plans to publish a set of recommendations that will aid participating states in enhancing the capacity of their reception centers to better identify and assist trafficking victims. This will aid in the identification of particularly vulnerable groups, including children, asylum seekers, and refugees. This is timely given that, as many practitioners are aware, NRMs do not often serve their core purpose of assisting victims in this respect. More work also needs to be done to effectively prevent trafficking for labor exploitation. That is why addressing this pervasive global trend and ensuring the effective identification and elimination of exploitative practices in supply chains continues to be a focus of my office. Our another project entitled The Prevention of Trafficking in Human Beings in Supply Chains Through Government Procurement and Measures aims at developing a set of model guidelines, including for fair recruitment, public procurement, and transparency practices that will minimize the risk of purchasing products and services which have been produced by trafficked or exploited labor. These model guidelines will reflect the existing promising practices and recommendations of discussions held with officials responsible for prevention of human trafficking and public procurement policies from OC participating states during a series of workshops conducted in Berlin, London, Stockholm, Astana, and in a few weeks in Geneva. I believe that such projects remain critical in ensuring that states provide incentives for businesses to act with due diligence to prevent the abuse and exploitation of workers, recognize ethical business, and encourage businesses to develop knowledge about the risk of trafficking. In the coming years, my office will continue to address these and other identified shortcomings in the implementation of relevant OC commitments in cooperation with the participating states, the OC executive structures, and our field operations. And I particularly look forward to working with you, civil society representatives, governmental officials, in order to achieve this, strengthen multi-stakeholder initiatives and foster a multidisciplinary approach in preventing and combating trafficking in human beings. Finally, in this regard, I would like to mention that last year, with the support of Switzerland, my office started to work more closely with anti-trafficking non-governmental organizations. In November 2016, we held the first consultation meeting in Geneva with 23 NGOs from 22 participating states, the proceedings of which clearly demonstrated the necessity to reaffirm the critical role of civil society in preventing and combating trafficking in human beings. Tomorrow, in the margins of the Human Dimension Implementation meeting, a second consultation meeting will take place with another set of anti-trafficking NGOs. And the outcomes of the consultations we plan to present in an occasional paper to be published early next year. While the road ahead is not without challenge, I remain convinced that by adopting an all-inclusive approach to combating human trafficking, particularly in terms of civil society and business, we can and will continue to translate OC commitments into concrete actions. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the productive discussion during this session.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jabosinova, for this presentation of the highlights from a wide range of activities of the Office for the Special Representative and Coordinator for Combating Trafficking in Human Beings, and also some of the recommendations stemming from these activities, which I'm sure will form the basis also for many of our efforts of many of us in this room to combat trafficking. I will now move on to our second introducer today, Mr. Yunus Mohammed Ii. Before giving him the floor, I will briefly introduce him. He was forced to leave Afghanistan in 1997. He then stayed in Pakistan and then Iran, where he worked for 13 years to support refugees, always with the hope of returning to Afghanistan. He then returned to continue his education, but then was arrested and jailed by the Taliban, and he escaped and became a refugee again. When it became clear that he could not return to his country, he continued to Turkey and then Greece, where he arrived in 2001 and was recognized as a political refugee. He actively participated in the creation of the Afghan community in Greece, of which he was elected president from 2009 to 2013. Elected as president of the Greek Forum of Refugees in 2013, he's active in providing everyday support for refugees, as well as working to advocate for the rights across Greece and beyond. He's also committed to defending women's rights and serves as an ambassador for White Ribbon, one of the world's largest campaigns to end violence against women. In 2015, he was elected as a bureau member of the European Migration Forum in Brussels, and in 2016 as a member of the National Council Against Racism of the Ministry of Justice. In 2016, Mr. Mohammed Ii's work and commitment were honored by Human Rights Watch when he was awarded the Alison de Forges Award for Extraordinary Activism. Mr. Mohammed Ii, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, dear representatives and dear colleagues, good afternoon. First, please allow me to congratulate the organizers of HDIM holding such an important event. It is a great honor for me as the representative of refugee communities in Greece to have this opportunity to be a voice in this discussion. I would like to speak about my personal experience as a refugee and also as a person working with refugees to address their problems and supporting them. The situation in Greece and indeed in the whole Mediterranean region right now is critical. Seeking refuge is not easy. It is very difficult to leave your homeland where you were born and grew up. Living is the choice of last resort and one's last hope for survival. It is not an organized journey. You cannot decide where to go and whom to take with you. Everyone grabs desperately at anything in order to survive. I'm a refugee in Greece. My father sought refuge in Russia. My mother and one of my brothers are now in Australia. One of my sisters is in the United States. One is in India, and the other is in Pakistan. Although we are separated as family, I feel lucky because I lost just one brother at the age of 16, and the others are alive somewhere. There are thousands of other refugees and forcibly displaced people who have either lost their lives or all the members of their family. No one wants to leave their homes or their country voluntarily. If they are forced to leave their homes, they first move to the closest, safest place, usually neighboring villages, hoping to be able to return back home one day. But facing further instances of violence and insecurity and losing the hopes, they are pushed further and further away from home. This is also my personal story. I left my home country in 1997 and ultimately arrived in Greece in 2001. The journey took me 4 years from Afghanistan to Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, and finally to Greece. Like so many other asylum seekers, my desire to survive was so strong that I was willing to risk my life in oceans, in high mountains, and to sometimes hostile strangers. A refugee's journey is not an ordinary journey. Refugees are not allowed to cross borders freely. They are in a situation that is known as being between the devil and deep blue sea. This is where human traffickers and smugglers appear. They sell hope of safety and security, but turn out to be criminals who value money over humanity. Enslave people and destroy people's life. They commit horrendous acts of sexual violence, beating, taking children hostage in order to extort more money. They even commit murder. Overall, these crimes are committed with great impunity. In order to stop these crimes and ensure safety and basic human rights for refugees, we must focus on the root causes. There is an urgent need of global political will to stop wars, armed conflicts, structural injustice, gender inequality, and the absence of the rule of law. In addition, corruption aggravates these root causes. Secondly, OSCE participating states must ensure the safe and orderly passage of refugees in accordance with their international legal commitments. Thirdly, member states must provide effective protection and support in first safe countries and ensure the implementation of international human rights commitments. Otherwise, we increase exponentially the vulnerability that facilitate human trafficking. As a result, the human trafficker will fill the gaps through exploitation, debt bondage, and human suffering. For those who survive this human tragedy, some hundreds, thousands arrive to Europe. The question is, are they safe here? Are they safe from becoming again victims of trafficking? The answer is unfortunately no. I'm living in working in Greece with refugees, while acknowledging the significant improvements in reception conditions. For instance, accommodation for unaccompanied minors increased from 200 in 2014 to the present 2,000, from 200 to 2,000. More needs to be done still. The situation in hotspots and other reception centers is inhuman. The lack of effective protections and adequate services have left refugees in a situation of continuous vulnerability, which leave them exposed to human trafficking. For instance, there are large numbers of them trapped in the hand of traffickers at the center of Athens. Mechanisms and directives agreed by member states are not being implemented. For example, mechanism for relocation of 160,000 people from Greece and Italy has not been implemented. Some participating states have refused this responsibility sharing. Some governments create significant barriers to the Family Reunification Directive, which leaves families separated from each other. For instance, there is a father with a son in Greece. It is the case of before 1 week. The mother with a daughter is in Sweden. One daughter is in Netherlands, and another daughter is in Germany. They have been waiting for about 1 year to be reunited. These gaps created by governments push separated families into the hands of human traffickers. Now I would like to briefly speak about those who are in front line. They are NGOs, otherwise known as civil society, providing services and support to refugees in very challenging conditions, such as lack of funding and access to policy level to provide their knowledge and expertise in government policy decisions. It is evident from what I mentioned that responsibility sharing and solidarity is needed more than ever in Europe. It is time for a common and effective asylum policy. There is a need for durable and sustainable solutions and adequate services to vulnerable groups. We need powerful civil societies on the ground and more dialogue and cooperation between all stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mohammed, for this interesting and rich presentation, highlighting also from your own personal experiences the plight of refugees, those forced or displaced by conflict, highlighting also how in the migration flows the displacement of populations may also result in the increased vulnerability to trafficking, and making again some useful recommendations for OSCE participating states and all of us. It is now time to give the floor to all of you, to give the opportunity to all of you to make your interventions and statements. The speaker list is still open, but we are approaching our limit of 50. But should any of you again would like to add you add yourself to the speakers list, please do so. The speaking time, as we have an almost full list of speakers, is limited to 2 minutes, and I will signal when we have reached the time limit. And a kind reminder, please, on first speaking, introduce yourself, the name and organization or delegation or institution that you represent. Please keep comments brief and to the point, preferably listing first recommendations and focusing on recommendations. Criticism is welcome but should be constructive, and avoid, in line with what I've also just said, avoid reading lengthy prepared statements. This can be submitted to the document distribution center, which will then distribute them to all participants. With this, I would like now to open the floor to our first speaker in our speakers list. It's the Church of Almighty God, France, which will be followed by the European Federation for Freedom of Belief. Church of Almighty God, France, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I want to thank the ODIHR for giving me the opportunity to take the floor. I'm Monica, a member of the Church of Almighty God in France. I'd like to raise the issue of Chinese refugees on religious grounds in France who risk to be deported back to China. Our recommendations. We urge the French authorities not to deport the members of the Church of Almighty God, but to grant them political asylum. None of them has committed any illegal act in France. We will give their names to the delegation of France to the OSCE. They will not be made public for the safety of their families in China. I will start with the concrete case of a member of our church who has unsuccessfully applied for political asylum in France. His name is Wang Dongdong, 26 years old, born in China. In December 2015, he applied for political asylum in France. In July 2016, he was heard for 1 hour and a half by the OPRA, the French Office for the Protection of Refugees and Stateless Persons. In March this year, he received a letter from the OPRA saying his application was rejected. The OPRA acknowledged he was sharing the beliefs of the Church of Almighty God, a banned religious movement in China, and admitted some of their members might be persecuted because of their activities. However, the OPRA said there exist variations in the implementation of the law according to the status and visibilities of the targeted followers, the level of tolerance changing according to the local strategies of the authorities. And the OPRA concluded that the applicant had not brought convincing evidence showing he was persecuted or under threat of being persecuted. The OPRA also said he had not been arrested when he had left China with a touristic visa. In July 2017, he was rejected by the National Court of the Right to Asylum in Montpellier without giving him a chance of public hearing. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the European Federation for Freedom of Belief, which will be followed by Uzbekistan. European Federation for Freedom of Belief, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Good afternoon. I'm Alessandro Micarelli. I'm a human rights lawyer based in London, and I'm going to make this very brief statement about some cases of rejection at the Italian border of Muslim refugees holding regular United Nations travel documents traveling from the United Kingdom. I will report an actual case of Mr. Mohammed Ii. The name is one of fantasy to preserve its confidentiality. This gentleman is a former employee of the United Nations mission, and he was traveling from London to Rome. He holds a regular and valid UN travel document issued by the British authorities. He was traveling to Italy. Both the United Kingdom and Italy are signatory members of the Strasbourg Agreement on the abolition of visas for refugees of 1959. Once he was in Rome, he was told that he needed a visa to enter the country. Then, being a former employee of the United Nations, he knew what he was talking about and explained to the police officers he did not need a visa, as also stated on his travel document, next to the picture. In fact, over the last few years, he had been traveling over all over Europe, and he never was asked to provide a visa. Then he was explained that he needed a visa because following the terrorist attacks, the Ministry of Interior of Italy had adopted some internal directive aimed at rejecting people coming from some countries, and then he was just served with EU rejection notification and was sent back to London in 2 hours. I tried to get in touch with the Italian government, but I never got a response from them, asking them if this legislation has in fact been adopted or not. I've asked the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Italy to provide information about this. They have replied, they asked for further information from me, so we are just waiting for their response. So we would like to know from the Italian government if this legislation has been adopted, if Italy has decided to withdraw from the European agreement on the abolition of visas, if the Council of Europe has been informed of this decision, and at the same time we ask the British government if the British authorities are aware of these refusals occurring in Italy. Combating terrorism cannot be an excuse to erase people's rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Uzbekistan, followed by Human Rights Without Frontiers. Uzbekistan, you have the floor.
Добрый день.
Good afternoon. I represent the Prosecutor General of the Republic of Uzbekistan, where there is a group to combat trafficking in human beings. I would like briefly to talk about some of the practical measures put in place by Uzbekistan to combat trafficking in human beings. First and foremost, the President of Uzbekistan adopted a strategy on 5 specific orientations to be implemented starting in 2017 to combat the actions of criminal groups that engage in trafficking in human beings. So coordination among all ministries, severely punishing trafficking in human beings, raising the awareness of the population, making sure that civil society and the state administration cooperate closely on these issues, together with the mass media as well. In March of this year, the President of Uzbekistan promulgated a decree to strengthen the ways in which criminality is being combated, with a new committee put in place to combat trafficking in human beings. It meets every week, and it implements a program to prevent criminality over 2017-2018. And insofar as trafficking in human beings is concerned, in April of this year, a government decision was taken to investigate the situation of citizens who have left the Republic for a long period of time. There is an introduction of the foreign passport. Certain individuals have stickers put in their passport which prohibit them from crossing the border and leaving the country. In the present year, we have also entered into close partnership and cooperation agreements with a number of countries. And then there is a law on labor migration, where certain provisions have been strengthened with a view to preventing trafficking in human beings. But we want to work on further legal texts, and we would like to cooperate with ODIHR to make sure that we get it right. But the full text of the statement is available on the site.
Human Rights Without Frontiers, followed by the Russian Federation. Human Rights Without Frontiers, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. My name is Willy Fautre, Director of Human Rights Without Frontiers. My statement is about the exploitation of several hundreds of North Korean overseas workers in Poland. One of the sources used by Kim Jong-un to collect hard currencies abroad is to send North Korean workers abroad and to confiscate 80 to 90% of their salaries. It is estimated that over 50,000 North Koreans are working in approximately 20 countries. Poland is one of them, as highlighted in an extensive report of the Asian Center of the University of Leiden published last year. It is estimated that between 1.2 and 2.3 billion euros are collected by the North Korean regime from the exploitation of their overseas workers in the world. North Korea's military nuclear program would not exist as such without Pyongyang's access to hard currencies. Considering that the UN Security Council recently voted unanimously to impose strict new sanctions on North Korea in order to prevent Pyongyang from acquiring hard currencies, including through its overseas workers, our organization calls upon the Polish state to stop granting new work visas to North Korean workers, and to explain the contradiction between the findings of the Asian Center of the University of Leiden, which gives evidence that Poland issued again 187 new work permits to North Korean workers in 2016, and the official statement of Poland's delegation to the OSCE HDIM saying last year that no work permit had been issued to North Koreans that year. We also call upon the OSCE to collect data from its participating states regarding the issuance of work visas to North Korean citizens and the status of their workplace conditions. And at last, we call upon the European Commission to start a full investigation of the situation in Poland, and then, if necessary, to move on to the next level and start an infringement procedure against Poland in line with the legal avenues at its disposal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Russian Federation, to be followed by the Church of Almighty God, Netherlands. Russian Federation, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Moderator, ladies and gentlemen, we consider human trafficking as one of the biggest challenges to the international community. We think that countering trafficking is one of the most important areas of the OSCE's activities. We note the significant work done by the system of the Special Representative of trafficking, of the fight against trafficking, Ms. Yabusinova. We particularly welcome the Special Representative's efforts to organize a conference in OSCE in Moscow on public-private partnerships to counter human trafficking. It involved more than 40 countries from the OSCE and other regions, and the high-level representation meant it was possible to have valuable contributions and significant sharing of views. We particularly like to thank, on behalf of the Russian Federation, all those who took part in the Moscow conference. We also note the annual conference of the Alliance Against Trafficking in People, which this year was dedicated to the issue of human trafficking, and we believe that it's necessary that the OSCE continue active work in this area. One major concern are migrants under 18 unaccompanied. They suffer a terrible fate, living in awful conditions, no access to education or healthcare, and a large proportion of them, or rather, there's a large number of such child migrants coming each year, 10,000 or more. That's a terrible number. Without decent conditions, they become victims of crime. They are involved in prostitution, begging, or even organ theft and sale. So it's very important, as the Council of Europe did on the eve of International Human Trafficking Day, to pay particular attention to this question. And it's necessary to note the concern of illegal migrant trafficking to Europe. It's necessary to counter such organizations and their planning. And we need to recognize the rights of the vulnerable groups, particularly children, women, etc. They should be informed about the danger of falling into the hands of traffickers. Thank you very much indeed for your attention. The full text of this speech is available.
Here is the Church of Almighty God, Netherlands, to be followed by the United States of America. Church of Almighty God, Netherlands, you have the floor.
Thank you, moderator. Ladies and gentlemen,
Thanks to OSCE for giving me the chance to speak here. I'm a Christian of the Church of Almighty God, Netherlands. Today, I'm speaking in the name of my church members who applied for asylum in Germany. We were forced to risk our lives and flee to Germany because of the brutal persecution and the bloody repression of the Chinese Communist Party. Unfortunately, more than 85% of the applicants who have received the results are rejected by the Federal Office for Immigration and Refugees of Germany. Some officials inferred we were not persecuted in China because we could leave our country safely and legally. They concluded that we would not be in danger if we were sent back to China. In fact, the danger we would have to face when we were back really exists. The CCP has issued a secret document to identify the Chinese citizens who fled overseas. We have concrete cases of our church members who were arrested by the CCP after they were back to China. We will show you the detail during our set event. This year, 2 members of our church were forcibly taken away by the German police and almost deported to China. Now, one of them is in therapy because of the terrible experience. The other is out on bail and waiting for a new court decision, but may be deported at any time. At present, all the church members in Germany are living day and night with the fear of being sent back to China, where they will be arrested, detained, and tortured. Recommendations. We urge the German government to understand the fact that the CCP persecutes Christians, including the members of the Church of Almighty God, and not to deport us back to China, but to grant us political asylum. None of us has committed any illegal act in Germany. We also call upon the support of the OSCE to guarantee the protection of our basic human rights in Germany and in the OSCE member states. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the United States of America, to be followed by Armenia. United States, you have the floor.
Thank you, moderator. Since Europe's migration emergency began, the U.S. has contributed over $72 million to help create reception arrangements and provide life-saving assistance in the Western Balkans and Greece. We cooperate with Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Macedonia, Kosovo, Montenegro, and Serbia to train officials to identify vulnerable migrants. We help fund the Special Representative's project to train law enforcement regarding trafficking victims. We welcome Croatia's awareness-raising campaign regarding Roma communities, Montenegro's identification of children vulnerable to forced marriages, and Macedonia's efforts to protect Romani children on the streets. Increased labor and sex trafficking of asylum seekers was a result of reception centers offering inadequate protections. We commend Belgium for its efforts to identify and reduce exploitation at reception centers. We commend France for its new law that penalizes the purchase of commercial sex and its funding of programs through airlines and tourism operators describing the penalties for child sex tourism. Luxembourg and the Netherlands undertook similar efforts. The United States is leading an international alert system that will warn countries in advance about individuals who may travel from the U.S. for sex tourism. We welcome our arrangements with the UK and Slovakia on reciprocal notifications. Ukraine increased its anti-trafficking efforts, but Russian aggression has caused nearly 2 million Ukrainians to be displaced and vulnerable to exploitation. Russia reduced the vulnerability for citizens of some countries by issuing work permits. However, Russia expanded contracts under which the DPRK operates labor camps on Russian soil. Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan continued to coerce participation in the cotton harvest. We encourage Turkmenistan to follow Uzbekistan's example by permitting third-party monitoring. We urge both governments to transition to voluntary workers paid through market wages. Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and thanks for the attention.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Armenia, to be followed by Affirm Human Rights. Armenia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Our thanks go to distinguished speakers, Ambassador Jarbusinova and Mr. Mohammed Ii, for clearly outlining the link between the trafficking and issue of displaced people. I'll start with recommendations and will submit the full statement later on. The OSCE should keep high in its agenda human rights and fundamental freedoms of people residing in conflict areas, including their displaced population. OSCE should facilitate humanitarian access of the UNHCR and the UN special procedures to the refugees and internally displaced people in the conflict-affected areas in the entire OSCE area and fully implement Maastricht Ministerial Council decision 4/03 by upholding commitment on non-discrimination against asylum seekers, refugees and IDPs on the national and ethnic ground. Participating states should not prevent local integration of refugees and internally displaced persons in order to gain political advantages, including in conflict resolution. Displaced persons should not be misused as shield to justify violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms. We welcome that this year's HDIM has a topic of persons at risk of displacement in its agenda. This category of persons encompasses first and foremost those who are living in conflict areas, which are most affected category of population. In regard to NK conflict, the indigenous population of Artsakh is facing a constant threat to its physical security. Azerbaijani authorities are conducting a policy of total isolation of these people from the international community, its dehumanization and rejection of any human rights protection, including access to justice, as well as promotion and glorification of crimes perpetrated against them. The last year large-scale military offensive in April against Artsakh, which was accompanied by atrocities, led to forced displacement of thousands of people from borderline settlements, including Talish. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Affirm Human Rights, to be followed by Azerbaijan. Affirm Human Rights, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Abaski speaking for Affirm Human Rights. Due to the fact that many of the refugees and vulnerable persons who move into new territory within the European Union and other European states are highly vulnerable to traffickers, it's important that we review not just the legislation but also the new techniques that are used by the traffickers, as it's a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. Today, in one of the newspapers, The Times, there is an article about Syrian brides that are being offered at the rate of $1,200 each. Again, people who are subject to living in refugee camps are often frequently targeted by the traffickers. Even those who have limited status are again trafficked internally, given offers for jobs that don't exist, and therefore moved from city to city and then exploited. It's important that countries that have high numbers of people that are leaving them, such as around the Horn of Africa and West Africa, are assisted with reintegration programs for failed asylum applicants. One of the problems that we have is a lack of coordination with NGOs and with those governments to help them reintegrate refugees who have, or applicants who have been refused their immigration applications within the European countries. So there is the unwillingness of those who have been refused to go back because they feel there is no support and there's no assistance for them to reintegrate in their own home countries. Some of the things that should be done to ensure that there's better protection for migrants is, one, reducing the cost of applications. I know that within the United Kingdom, those who want to apply to extend their status often have to spend over £1,400. Part of it goes towards their NHS fee, part of it goes towards their home office fees. So this leaves it unattainable for many people who are not able to work. They feel that they don't have enough money then to renew and extend their status, therefore pushing them underground into illegal migration and therefore making them also vulnerable to traffickers. There's also the need to retrain frontline workers. This is to help them identify people who are susceptible to trafficking, vulnerable, not just those who may be in children or teens, but also in the home countries as well, making sure that children are approached and made to identify those who are likely to come into their lives and traffic them. It should start at the primary level, as many times people are often going towards their university and finishing their studies, and then unfortunately fall victim to traffickers, not being able to identify the risk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. The next speaker is Azerbaijan, to be followed by Belgium on behalf of the EU. Azerbaijan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Forced displacement of people in the OSCE area due to unresolved conflicts is one of the most acute problems requiring urgent action by the OSCE and its participating states. In the face of existing set of OSCE commitments on refugees and IDPs, it is very relevant to discuss the need of this vulnerable group and review challenges to implement existing commitments within the HDIM. Azerbaijan has been coping with refugees and IDPs problem for more than 20 years due to the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. Close to the 1 million Azerbaijans had been expelled from Armenia per se and the occupied territories of Azerbaijan. Protection of this vulnerable group, including addressing their social problems and restoration of their rights and freedoms, is a priority for the government of Azerbaijan. Nevertheless, the only durable and long-lasting solution to the issue can be achieved through ensuring the inalienable right to return to their habitual residence of displaced person in conformity with international norms and OSCE commitments. As all participating states agreed in Lisbon summit to facilitate return in safety and in dignity of refugees and IDPs to places of origin, our discussions here should focus on practical implementation of this commitment and highlight concrete measures aimed at overcoming obstacles to such return. In this context, we consistently underlined the urgency of withdrawal of occupying forces and comprehensive rehabilitation of the occupied territories. Moreover, assuring the right of return also constitutes rejection of the result of ethnic cleansing and offers an important measure of justice to these displaced from their homes and thereby removing a source of possible future tension and conflict. It is of concern that despite the absence of specific OSCE commitments, there are attempts to use the notion of rights of people residing in conflict zone as a compensation for the inclusion of topic on refugees and displaced persons to the agenda of HDIM. It should be underlined that no right can be exercised at the expense of the violation of others' rights, and such a discriminatory approach based on the denial of fundamental rights and freedoms of population expelled from conflict zone should be rejected. As for the comments raised toward my government, I will reply them during the right of reply. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Belgium on behalf of the EU, to be followed by the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. Belgium on behalf of the EU, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I have the honor to speak in this working session on behalf of the European Union and its member states, as well as of Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, Montenegro, and Georgia. And the full version of this statement will further on be distributed in writing. Trafficking in human beings has been high on the OSCE agenda for the past several years and continues to affect the lives of countless women, men, and children. This grave violation of their human rights is explicitly prohibited by the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, as well as by the European Convention on Human Rights. All EU member states are party to the Council of Europe Convention on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings. We welcome its entry into force in all EU member countries on the 1st of July 2017 and continue to fully support the work of the Convention's monitoring mechanism. The comprehensive policy review of anti-trafficking projects funded by the European Commission, published on the 23rd of September 2016, outlined the results of some 321 such projects, funded for a total of 158.5 million euro during the period in between 2004 and 2015. These projects ran in over more than 100 countries worldwide and gave 221 different principal grant holders the opportunity to combat trafficking in human beings. It showed that over half of the projects funded were led by NGOs, meaning that civil society is critically empowered to take action against this practice. The synergies created by the EU Civil Society Platform against Trafficking in Human Beings should also be mentioned. Their e-platform provides a collaborative space for future cooperation across borders. Similar initiatives could be rolled out across the OSCE region to empower civil society and to involve them as partners. We welcome the efforts undertaken for the implementation of the 2003 OSCE Action Plan and its 2013 addendum. We also welcome the work undertaken by the OSCE Special Representative and Coordinator for Combating Trafficking in Human Beings, Ambassador Jarbusunova. Still, we can and should do more. We therefore put forward the following recommendations. First, the dialogue and cooperation with civil society should be promoted. Second, as for internally displaced persons, we call upon the participating states to ensure the right of IDPs to a safe, dignified, and voluntary return, as stipulated in the UN Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement. Regarding IDPs, we remain committed to provide humanitarian aid and to tackle the root causes of their displacement. We regret the continuous increase of IDPs across the OSCE region.
I'm kindly asking you to conclude, please.
Yes, I will.
Thank you.
Sorry. Okay. Let me conclude then by repeating the EU's desire for the OSCE to act as a platform for elaborating a comprehensive OSCE response. The EU and its member states will remain committed to pursue an effective response involving close coordination and cooperation among all actors of society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, to be followed by Kazakhstan. Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, Ambassador Medina Jarbusnova, Excellencies and distinguished representatives of OSCE member states for granting me the floor. My name is Taina Biename, and I am the Executive Director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, one of the oldest international NGOs dedicated to ending the trafficking in women and girls using the lens of gender-based violence and discrimination. Our recommendations would include the continuation by OSCE to strongly collaborate with and support the role and work of civil society in combating the scourge of human trafficking, to remind member states of its obligations under human rights principles, international laws, and UN resolutions that offer clear tools that address human trafficking, including the Palermo Protocol, CEDAW, the 1949 Convention on the Suppression of Trafficking Persons and of the Exploitation of the Prostitution of Others. We also recommend that member states take appropriate measures, including legislation, to implement the 3 equal and distinct Sustainable Development Goals related to human trafficking, namely Target 5.2, Target 8.7, and Target 16.2. Finally, we urge member states to maintain a keen analysis of gender-based violence when addressing human trafficking. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimates that 71% of detected trafficking victims are women and girls, and 96% of sex-trafficked people are women and girls. Moreover, reports from around the world indicate that women and girls trafficked for forced labor are also frequently victims of sexual violence and sexual exploitation. We look forward to further collaboration with the OSCE. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Kazakhstan, to be followed by Iroko Onlus. Kazakhstan, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Askerov Abla, I represent the Ministry of Home Affairs of the Republic of Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan considers its cooperation with the OSCE to be very useful and important, and it is very grateful for the organization of today's meetings. Now, the president of the country in the recent strategy has noted that treating women as goods and turning them into sexual slaves is something that must be combated, and various measures have been put in place to combat trafficking in human beings. This is one of the priorities of the activities of all of the entities of the state administration. There are many dozen specific agreements that Kazakhstan has entered into with other countries to combat trafficking in human beings and has signed some 13 international conventions in this field. And we fulfill all of our commitments under those texts in order to combat the criminal groups that engage in human being trafficking. The crime of trafficking can result in a 15-year sentence, confiscation of property, and these punishments seem to be sufficiently strict to combat the phenomenon. We have an inter-ministerial committee, which is a consultative group of the government, and special plans are adopted every year to combat trafficking, and various NGOs as well as state bodies are involved in developing this. There is a special mechanism for taking care of and rehabilitating the victims of trafficking. We actively cooperate with NGOs. There are some 20 of them which were represented in all regions of the country that deal with trafficking. Now, every year, the State Department of the U.S. Evaluates the activities of countries in what they are doing to combat trafficking. And in the most recent report, Kazakhstan was put into the second group. We are interested in continuing our work with NGOs and others, and we believe that today's session will make a contribution to improving this work and to ensuring more stability in my country. Thank you.
The Human Rights Movement of Crimea. Iroko Onlus, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. My name is Esohe Agatise. I'm the Executive Director of Associazione Iroko, an NGO providing services to victims of trafficking, migrants and refugees in Italy. I'm here today to draw attention to the situation of sub-Saharan Africans who are coming into Europe through the Mediterranean and are being branded as economic migrants and as such not eligible for protection. They are people who go through the most horrendous kind of situations. They cross the Mediterranean under terrible conditions that we all know. If they don't drown, they are branded as economic migrants and they are denied protection. The ILO has reported that about 80% of these people can respond to the definition of trafficking victims. And yet, when they come into Europe, they are not given the adequate protection that they should be given. And we find that a large majority of them are women and children who are subjected to different kinds of deprivations. They are picked up from many of the refugee centers where they end up in and taken to the people who then exploit them. And because of the special situations that many of these women and children are in, for instance, the women who are subjected to sexual exploitation have to undergo some what is called juju rights, which makes it impossible for them to report their traffickers. And yet, if they don't report, the police cannot intervene. And so they continue to be subjected to violence and exploitation. So my recommendation and our request is that state members should please look into this situation to make sure that the full and effective implementation of referral mechanisms are used to adequately identify those that are victims of trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Human Rights Movement of Crimea, to be followed by Ukraine. Human Rights Movement of Crimea, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. I'm with the Human Rights Movement in Crimea. The problem that I would like to speak to today is the refusal of the State Migration Service of Ukraine to provide status of refugees or status of an individual requiring special protection in Ukraine to Russian citizens who are repressed in their own country for political reasons. Often regional offices recommend that the status be granted because regional specialists meet these people, they study their situation, and they provide a lot of evidence showing that they deserve refugee status. But then the central office rejects this, and it goes to court, and usually the refugees win. This shows that the Migration Service is passing on its responsibility to the judiciary. Now, the first scandal that occurred in this regard was when Ukraine returned to Uzbekistan some refugees after the well-known Andijan events of 2005. And at that time, there was a sort of an unwritten agreement that refugees would be returned to the territory of the Russian Federation and the CIS. Over the last 3 years, the flow of people needing refugee status has increased. This is partly because Russia is abusing mechanisms like Interpol and other international institutions to engage in political repression against its citizens. They're charged with terrorism and refusing to provide this refugee status. Ukraine is becoming a co-conspirator in political repression. And Ukraine is in a situation where many of its citizens in occupied territories are subject to trumped-up and mendacious charges. So it is all a nonsense to return these people and not to give them refugee status. Now, of course, every country has the right to protect its own national security, but a situation like refugees requires a very well-defined approach, because this can have an effect on the fate and even the life of a specific individual. Thank you.
Just a kind reminder to those civil society colleagues taking the floor to do so from the seat reserved for civil society, where there is a nameplate saying civil society. Thank you very much. The next speaker is Ukraine, to be followed by La Strada International. Ukraine, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Natalia Filvolch, Deputy Minister for Social Policy in Ukraine, moderator, Your Excellency, dear colleagues. Ukraine supports international efforts to combat all forms of violation of human rights in conflict and post-conflict situations. We have ratified all of the basic international texts that seek to combat trafficking in human beings. Over the last 2 years, we have increased the number of identified victims of trafficking by 50% and have assisted them. Now, despite all of the positive achievements of Ukraine in the area of combating trafficking, for our country there is a huge problem with the occupation by the Russian Federation of part of the territory of Ukraine. We have a lot of reports about violation of human rights on the territory of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and also the Lugansk and Donetsk Oblast. There are reports of sexual exploitation of women and forced labor by men. More than a 400-kilometer border with the Russian Federation is not in the control of Ukraine, and a lot of arms and munitions are crossing. Unfortunately, the present situation is not being paid attention to by international organizations, and these reports of violations of human rights are not being investigated. 4% of the population of the country have had to leave the territories that are occupied and are internally displaced. In 2016, there was a lot of talk about the recruitment of Ukrainian citizens to work supposedly as couriers, but in fact they ended up being forced to transport narcotics. We have 210 reports of such individuals becoming victims, and we ask for the possibility to meet with them and to help them when they are detained in the Russian Federation, but that is ignored, which is in violation of UN and Council of Europe conventions. We have managed to save 2 Ukrainian citizens who, under those circumstances, found themselves detained in Brazil, and we would like to thank the government of Brazil. So, dear colleagues, we believe that the OSCE should be a platform for working out international instruments that would effectively make it possible to react and protect these vulnerable people, especially women, children, and the disabled. Thank you for your attention.
Human Rights Movement, Birduino, Kyrgyzstan. La Strada International, you have the floor.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear moderator, I represent indeed La Strada International, and I represent a network of total 28 NGOs who at a daily level directly assist trafficked persons all over Europe. On behalf of all of them, I would like here to take the opportunity to state that although the OSCE member states take a lot of action and although there's very good legislation in place, we would like to see more efforts taken to ensure that this legislation is also adequately implemented in practice, because we see a lot of bottlenecks at the daily level. First of all, we would like to see more identification of victims. We would like people to look more at the refugees and migrants coming to their countries, but also at undocumented workers, domestic workers and sex workers, because we very often see that they are not identified, and currently only 1 or 2% of the people of the estimations that we know from international estimations are identified. We also see the need for better adequate assistance and support to trafficked persons, and the need for better and free legal support and access to remedies, including compensation. We would like to stress that the best prevention for human trafficking is to ensure that all people have adequate assistance and protection in place, including workers, whether they work in informal economies or formal economies, because only then we will address really human trafficking.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Human Rights Movement Bearduino, Kyrgyzstan, to be followed by Moldova. Human Rights Movement Bearduino, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, moderator. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, expert. I represent a human rights movement delivering reports on refugees in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and on internal migrants. So I'd like to begin with recommendations. We would like to focus on results. Last year we recommended to Kazakhstan and the Russian Federation to ratify the ILO Convention on working migrants and also on employment agencies and decent labor, decent work rather, and also adopt the protocol on economic cultural rights. But we've given the example of 14 migrants in Moscow. Now, we talked about this case. We wrote to the local authorities, and what we wanted to focus on was that migrants working in Russia are extremely vulnerable. They face racism, they face attacks, and we've seen many cases of this. In April 2016, we saw radicals attacks in a number of areas, some of them resulting in deaths. In Kazakhstan, there is human trafficking, and Your Excellency, we've created a new group on gender equality, and I hope that Ms. Haig from Germany and other members will join us in working on this issue. The problems I've addressed in Kazakhstan and elsewhere need an approach based on gender equality. The violation of children and women's rights is particularly high because they're vulnerable. There are many migrants in Russia who, the high proportion of which are women, so it's particularly their needs we need to focus on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Moldova, to be followed by the International Center for Women Rights Protection and Promotion, La Strada. Moldova, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Diana Comerzan. I represent the Permanent Secretariat of the National Committee for Combating Trafficking in Human Beings, and I would like to draw your attention to some of Moldova's achievements in the anti-trafficking field. That is a high priority for our country. As a novelty for our country is finalizing at the moment of the national strategy for preventing and combating trafficking in human beings for 6 years, and the action plan for 3 years to implement the strategy. These documents will replace the former national action plan realized between 2000 2014-2016 and will be based on the conclusions, findings and recommendations of the international and national reports on implementing the United Nations and Council of Europe conventions. Furthermore, one of the main achievements represents the law on the rehabilitation of victims of crime adopted in 2016 that includes also the trafficking human beings victims as beneficiaries. The law introduces the state financial compensation for the damage caused by the offense, provision that will enter into force as from 1st January 2018. The financial compensation to be granted to victims shall constitute the government's first step in the realization of the international standards and practices recommendations. Another important issue is related to the national referral system of Moldova that had been evaluated by an international independent expert, and the report was presented recently during an international event in Chisinau. At the same time, by two national experts is being elaborated in-depth study on national referral system that will provide clear and practical recommendations on the future concept of national referral system. For that purpose, the government will continue to consolidate legal framework and the national policies in terms of 4P paradigm: prevention, punishment, protection and partnership. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the International Center for Women's Rights Protection and Promotion, La Strada, to be followed by Switzerland. International Center for Women's Rights Protection and Promotion, you have the floor.
Добрый день, уважаемые участники.
Good afternoon, Titania Famitha, and I'd like to take this opportunity to give you a few outcomes of the research which my colleague from Moldova has completed, being one of the two countries to have carried out research on the national mechanism of Moldova, which has been at work now for a number of years. And now there can be no doubt that the national mechanism of relocation affected not only the role of the state in this area, but giving assistance. There have been a number of problems which have been resulting from the traditional situation that exists. As a result of the research that's been done, we've been able to see that, well, let me give you one example. The survey of the representatives of the social protection system said that they don't fully understand the system's responsibility for providing health to victims of trafficking. The system hasn't been effective in the past in helping women, children, the aged. So we have seen the signing of international conventions, which hasn't been successfully transposed into the laws relating to traffickers and the law relating to social protection. We're seeing many projects being developed, but people don't understand that it's necessary to implement these on an ongoing basis rather than a temporary basis. So our government needs to introduce the national mechanism for identifying trafficking and adopt the coordinators, or appoint the coordinators, and ensure the integration of these standards into the social protection system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Switzerland, to be followed by the United Kingdom. Switzerland, you have the floor.
Thank you, Moderator. Humanitarian crisis and armed conflict pose particular challenges to the fight against human trafficking. Humanitarian actors are increasingly confronted with trafficking and have a role to play in prevention and protection. However, studies show that humanitarian response does not always sufficiently take into consideration trafficking in persons. Knowledge and awareness of trafficking needs to be systematically mainstreamed into the response to humanitarian crises and situations of armed conflicts. Forced displacement and migration create particular vulnerabilities and opportunities for trafficking and exploitation, including labor exploitation and other consequences that have been described by the introducers in their intervention and for which we thank them. A year ago, heads of states and governments met in New York at the high-level summit on large movements of refugees and migrants. Recognizing that the international community is not sufficiently prepared to respond to such movements, it was decided to develop a global compact on refugees and one on safe, orderly and regular migration in order to strengthen our response in the future. We call upon states to join the efforts in finding a way to adequately and coherently address forced displacements in the global compacts. Also, nearly 1 year ago, the OSCE Ministerial Council adopted its decision 3/16 on OSCE's role in the governance of large movements of migrants and refugees. This decision embedded the topic into the OSCE's approach of comprehensive security. Indeed, there is a nexus between security and global and/or regional governments of large movements of migrants and refugees. This nexus must be better understood, and adequate measures addressing it must be implemented. We will circulate the recommendations that we have. Thank you, Moderator.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the United Kingdom, to be followed by Bulgaria. United Kingdom, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'd also like to thank the two speakers for their introduction to this topic and their insights into the subject. The UK fully aligns with the statement delivered by Belgium on behalf of the EU and its member states, and would like to add some remarks in our national capacity. 1 year ago, the UK Prime Minister, Theresa May, spoke to the UN General Assembly about the need for a global response to the global problem of modern slavery, human trafficking and forced labour. This year, we will be launching a call to action, asking the international community to move from words to actions, putting the commitments made in the Sustainable Development Goals into practice. Modern slavery is a global challenge requiring a global response. One of the most egregious aspects of human trafficking is the concept of individuals being bought and sold, traded like commodities for financial profit. It is estimated that modern slavery is a business with an annual turnover of $150 billion, bigger than the US banking sector or the economies of many countries. We therefore need a coordinated response across the international community. We need enhanced cooperation on law enforcement to make sure those criminal gangs exploiting the most vulnerable in our societies are brought to justice. We need better mechanisms for protecting victims, both from slavery and the consequences of actions they may take as a result of their enslavement. We need to ensure our policies and practices put victims first. The OSCE, through ODIHR and through the Office of the Special Representative and Coordinator, is ideally placed to help us meet that challenge. The international community has an opportunity now to show how it can come together to be greater than the sum of its parts. The OSCE, participating states and civil society can bring their expertise to bear as part of that coordinated, coherent response. Finally, as chair of the Human Dimension Committee, we were pleased to work with our Norwegian and Kazakh colleagues to bring together the 3 OSCE committees to discuss the challenges of preventing trafficking in human beings and modern slavery. We will also be exploring this issue further in our side event on Wednesday lunchtime in Meeting Room 3, to which you are all invited. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Bulgaria, to be followed by the Azerbaijan Institute for Democracy and Human Rights. Bulgaria, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, Ambassador Jarbusinova, Your Excellencies. My name is Kamelia Dimitrova, Secretary of Bulgaria's Anti-Trafficking Commission. First of all, we align ourselves with the statement of the EU delivered by Belgium. Combating trafficking in persons has remained high on the agenda of Bulgarian government last year. Notably, in 2017, this year, we adopted the National Strategy for Combating Trafficking in Human Beings, 2017-21, and we started implementing the National Action Plan for Countering Trafficking in Human Beings. Its implementation has already delivered clear results. In 2017, we doubled Bulgaria's capacity to provide assistance to victims of trafficking by opening 2 new shelter facilities for children victims of trafficking and also for adult victims. The shelters are located in Sofia. In 2017, we continued the implementation of the national referral mechanisms for support of trafficking victims, and to respond to the questions of the moderator on how to increase the effectiveness of NRMs and building on our experience, I can say the following. First of all, increase the legal status of the NRM. In Bulgaria, this was done by a decree of the government, of the Council of Ministers. Second of all, provide annual trainings on national and local levels to all stakeholders in the NRM. Third of all, assess the national referral mechanism in Bulgaria. This is done in cooperation with the ICMPD. In the coming period, we need to take into account the changing nature of the crime of trafficking and the modus operandi of its perpetrators. In this global age, internet has increasingly been used by trafficking for recruitment and control of victims. But internet has also an opportunity to counter the crime as a reliable platform for general and targeted prevention campaign. Bulgaria plans to hold an international expert forum on the topic of internet as a mechanism of recruitment and prevention. This will be a discussion that we start in October this year. A recommendation in this line: we need to continue to share knowledge and information on the role of the internet, and an OSCE could be a capacity building platform for training participants following, again, the success of the simulation training. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Azerbaijan Institute for Democracy and Human Rights, to be followed by the Institute of European Studies. Azerbaijan Institute for Democracy and Human Rights, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ahmad Shahidov. I represent Azerbaijan Institute for Democracy and Human Rights. Today's discussion is very relevant to all of us because trafficking in human beings is actual for all countries represented here. Wars, massacres, and refugees are reason for spread rapidly of human trafficking. So thousands of people fleeing from Iraq and Syria are victims of human trafficking. This problem is actual for Azerbaijan as well. That's why I want to share some remarks about the work carried out by Azerbaijan in the fight against trafficking in human beings. Azerbaijan has made a great stride in recent years in the fight against human trafficking. We have perfect legal framework and education system in this field. In this regard, Azerbaijan carried out cooperation with international organizations in the framework of the National Action Plan to combat human trafficking. Steps are being taken very seriously in the field of defining of potential human trafficking, awareness, integration, and reintegration of victims in society. The work done in the field of combating human trafficking is reflected in the reports prepared by international organizations. The performance of the obligations arising from international instruments ratified by the country is assessed positively. As you know, the main reasons for human trafficking are wars, conflicts, and flow of refugees. Captives and hostages, especially women and children, are the victims of human trafficking. We see it in Iraq and Syria today. ISIS and other terrorist groups convert women who were taken captive to trafficking in human beings, exploit them, sell them, breed them, torture and kill them. It's an international problem and the whole world must fight together. Azerbaijan is also suffering from this problem. We have been facing the problem of refugees and internally displaced persons since 1990. I wanted to underline the humanitarian consequences of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. 1 million ethnic Azerbaijanis were driven out from their homes as a result of this conflict, and the occupied Azerbaijan's Nagorno-Karabakh region and 7 surrounding districts are a humanitarian disaster zone, and the fundamental rights of people living there are violated. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Institute of European Studies, to be followed by the Human Rights Educational Center. Institute of European Studies, you have the floor.
Спасибо.
Thank you. My name is Ekaterina Kachok, and I represent the Institute of European Studies in Latvia. At the present time, in the EU, it is quite possible, quite legally, to kidnap children. This results when you have a couple with different citizenships of the EU and live in a third country, and so the child can be registered at the same time in 2 countries. And in fact, the number of such children is rather high. It seems to be about 10% of children born in Europe are born in countries other than the citizenship of their parents. And then you have a conflict between the parents, they divorce, and each of them can independently register the child in their country of citizenship. So the child can be legalized in a given country despite the contrary will of the other parent. So that is a way for one parent to prevent the other parent from having contact with the child, and this amounts to kidnapping. And this is something that cannot be resolved by family law in countries. It takes far too much time.
Human beings, refugees and displaced persons, and persons at risk of displacement. Please continue with a focus on those topics. Thank you.
Да, конечно же.
Well, of course. Now, sometimes it takes years for a judicial decision to be taken. In the meantime, the children are taken by some other country. The other parent wouldn't even know about this. They can be educated there. So we believe that there should be a single system for the registration of children born to EU citizens, no matter in which country that takes place, the birth takes place. And that way one can guarantee access to education, to healthcare for these children, and make it impossible for parents to keep the child away from the other parent.
Human Rights Educational Center, to be followed by Political Movement Group 24. Human Rights Educational Center, you have the floor.
Thank you. Уважаемые участники, уважаемый модератор.
All participant countries of the OSCE signed the UN Refugee Convention. We believe that there needs some kind of problem here, which is the division of economic migrants from refugees. Quite often there's a confusion between these two terms and therefore violate human rights. We have a document from Bavaria, Germany, to show that there was confusion between the identification of individuals seeking asylum with refugee, and that violated the rights of many people seeking asylum. It's clear that there's more information required here. We've already reported here about an arrest of a poet Vladimir Neklaeva in Minsk protesting against the Belarus occupation. People need to know what their legislation is, and particularly know the case of the country involved. Germany needs to disseminate information on the threat to life and to limb of democratic activists in Belarus. This wasn't done in 2012 when we made the request after publication of our report on the criminal circles involved in Lukashenko's regime. We believe that it's necessary to focus on helping refugees from Belarus in Germany. Now, unfortunately, Poland is not a country which has expressed solidarity with Belarus, and Belarusians know this. The foreign minister has announced that the lie that there are 300,000 Belarusian refugees. That's certainly not the case. There are only a handful. There are also very few migrants, only about 28,000. So this again is a lie from the minister. I suggest that everybody goes to the Polish website to see this false information, the Office for Foreigners of Poland. Thank you.
Movement Group 24, to be followed by Eurasian Dialogue. Political Movement Group 24, you have the floor.
Спасибо, уважаемый модератор.
Thank you very much, moderator. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is also John Safarov, and a representative of the Political Movement Group 24, and a representative of a youth movement in Tajikistan. Now, the trafficking in human beings is subject to criminal liability. It amounts to putting people into slavery, and it doesn't matter whether it occurs within a country or across borders. If there is a force involved, there is manipulation and extortion with a view to sexual exploitation or putting people into forced labor. Now, trafficking in human beings can also be seen to be as a modern form of slavery. It is often organized by criminal networks and labor agencies supposedly give people jobs, but they can be involved in trafficking. And this occurs in Tajikistan. Sometimes children, women, young girls simply disappear. They are supposedly given work in another country, but they end up being forced into prostitution. Their passports are taken away, so they cannot flee. There is the example from 2015 of the company Income that sent women supposedly to work in Saudi Arabia, but there their passports were taken away and they became slaves. These moral and physical victims have often been in touch with the mass media to try to gain their freedom. But the company in question has the powers that be behind it, and so there have been no charges brought. This has been well reported in the foreign media, but not within the country. Another significant problem is individuals who are applying for political refugee status. And this is quite clear. There's a despotic, dictatorial regime in the country, so it's quite natural that these people would want to flee. We have provided additional information about this on the OSCE website, and I thank you very much for your attention.
The next speaker is Eurasian Dialogue, to be followed by Albania. Eurasian Dialogue, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, moderator. Eurasian Dialogue, Tajikistan. Ladies and gentlemen, autocracy and their policies applies pressure to those with different viewpoints. It interferes with the private life of individuals, and that's one of the fundamental reasons for the humanitarian crisis in the world. One of the examples of such interference in private life of citizens is the new legal initiatives by the authorities in Tajikistan to apply specific prohibitions. Last week, the report on political rights and gender equality and zero tolerance for other fundamental human rights was something which was applied to our citizens who were deprived of basic human rights.
Of the topics: trafficking, refugees and displaced persons, and persons at risk of displacement. Yes.
Yes, refugees. Yes, I'm talking about refugees. The international community is countering the consequences in some parts of the world while failing to see the same causes emerging in other parts of the world. We look on the refugee crisis in North Africa and Middle East, and we do not see the same threats in Central Asia. Ladies and gentlemen, today Tajikistan is being subjected to a third wave of forced displacement. People are moving, and as I've said, the adoption of new laws applies not only to journalists and political activists who are leaving Tajikistan, but also simple citizens who are facing new bans. If I were younger, I would also run from the country because they don't allow me to name or give my child the name I want to give my child. I would refer you to the full text of our statement, which is available on the OSCE site. Thank you for your attention.
Apologies. Thank you very much. The next speaker is Albania, to be followed by the European Center for Artsakh. Albania, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Albania aligns itself with the statement delivered on behalf of the European Union, and I would like to add the following remarks in my national capacity. The Albanian authorities put special attention to the prevention of the trafficking, as well the protection and assistance to its victims. Following the ratification of the UN Convention and the Council of Europe Convention, a word of the integrating and cross-dimension approach needed to counter human trafficking in all its forms, the effort of the Albanian authorities have focused mainly on the completion and national regulation framework and putting in place appropriate national mechanism at the central and regional level. In the meantime, in the area of human trafficking, significant achievements have been made in the past years. The establishment of some important cross-sectoral structure for the coordinating and anti-trafficking efforts. The adoption of the fight strategy against human trafficking in 2014 and the action plan 2014-2017 with the purpose of increasing the number of proactive investigation of victims of trafficking, the purpose of identification, referral, assistance and reintegration of the victims and potential victims of the trafficking, the approval of the action plan for the social and economic reintegration of human and girls victims of trafficking in 2016, with the implementation of the strategy and action plan 2014-2017, the signing of Memorandum of Understanding on the identification of cases of forced labor and trafficking with the intention of exploitation work of others in 2014. The signing of Memorandum of Understanding on the establishment of the task force for integrating analysis and neglecting human trafficking in December 2015 in order to ensure the multi-institution approach for detailing review and quality improvement of anti-trafficking action and for conducting an analysis of the criminal legislation. It is due to this measure and the increasing capacity of our law enforcement agencies that the fight against trafficking and of human beings and the protection of victims and trafficking have seen major importance. We avail ourselves to this opportunity to express appreciation for the fruitful cooperation with the OSCE presence in Albania, whose support have been particularly important in regarding of the training of human resources and law enforcement structures, as well as different state and civil society stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the European Center for Artsakh, to be followed by the Crimean Human Rights
Excuse me, Chair. I think 30th is the Open Dialogue Foundation, if I'm not mistaken.
I was informed to delete the Open Dialogue Foundation by your colleague. Yes, in this case, then please go ahead. It's the Open Dialogue Foundation. You have the floor.
All right, thank you. Dear Chair, I'm Dr. Uğur Tok, representing Open Dialogue Foundation. I'm drawing your attention to human rights violations in Turkey, which triggered a new form of refugees and displaced persons in Europe and America. In the morning session, I mentioned that after the last year's coup attempt, a major breakdown took place on Turkish internal and external politics. There has been a sharp changes on the way of governing country, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law principle in Turkey. These sharp political changes created a wave of victimization of its own people of Turkey. With the coup attempt last year, Mr. Erdogan blamed the Gülen movement members, and without fair trial procedures, tens of thousands of people were put in jail, lost their jobs, and lost their private assets, which were result of tens of years of hard work. Last week, Mr. President ordered to build another 50 prisons with a capacity of 1,000 people each, meaning this trend will continue. On the items of this seat is combating trafficking in human beings. Tragicomic enough, I condemn human trafficking But at the same time, this may end. I may end praying up for my own friends to pass the border with a human trafficker to run for their lives from witch hunt to freedom. Because of the situation in Turkey now, there are doctors, academics, journalists, teachers, business people, and other highly qualified professionals who fled for their lives and their families and asylum seek in the Western countries who once became part of Gülen movement. I want to underpin that these are not economic migrants who came with the better standard life expectations than they had, but only coming with the fear of their lives. Before I conclude, I want to take this opportunity to thank all the representatives of countries who opened doors of their countries to Gülen movement people fleeing from Turkey, starting from Greece, Germany, Sweden, UK, France, Belgium, Netherlands, US, and Canada, and the countries which ever opened their doors to Gülen people but not mentioned here. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much. Then we are back to the order that I mentioned before. The next speaker is the European Center for Artsakh, to be followed by the Crimean Human Rights Group. European Center for Artsakh, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. My name is Grigorian. I represent an NGO from Germany. I would like to take this opportunity to express my concern about the continuing lack of attention by OSCE institution to human rights and fundamental freedoms of people living in conflict areas, especially the refugees and displaced persons. Refugees and internally displaced persons began to appear in Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, along with the intensification of the conflict that arose as a result of attempts by Azerbaijani authorities to use force to suppress the right of Armenian population of Artsakh to self-determination. During 1988-1991, more than 1,000 Armenians from Azerbaijan fled to Nagorno-Karabakh. Today there are over 30,000 refugees and displaced persons living in Artsakh. In addition to this, a new wave of displacement was triggered by Azerbaijani aggression against Artsakh in April 2016, which was accompanied by unprecedented atrocities both against civilians and soldiers of the Artsakh Defense Army. Unlike other situations, displaced persons living in conflict areas are deprived of international protection and assistance due to systematic attempts by some participating states to impede the humanitarian access of international organizations. Furthermore, due to the persistent non-compliance of Azerbaijan with its international commitments or non-use or threat of force, a significant part of the population of Artsakh are constantly exposed to the risk of displacement. This situation must be changed. Human rights and fundamental freedoms of displaced persons living in conflict areas should be high on the agenda of the OSCE in the OSCE region, without exception. The events of April 2016 demonstrated how dangerous it is to ignore the issues of protecting the rights of people living in conflict areas. It can lead to serious consequences for regional peace and security. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Crimean Human Rights Group, to be followed by Spain. Crimean Human Rights Group, you have the floor.
Thank you. Now in Crimea is a number of social groups that are being forcibly displaced to the territory of Russian Federation. First, it's the prisoners. Displacement applies even to citizens of Ukraine who are being imprisoned by the verdict of Ukrainian authorities. According to the Regional Human Rights Center, since the beginning of the occupation, no less than 4,600 people have been taken from Crimea to the Russian, at least 6 of them deaths in the Russian colonies due to the lack of necessary medical care for Ukrainian citizens. A few more people are now on the verge of life and death. The inhabitants of Crimea refuse to go to places of imprisonment in Russia, insisting on their Ukrainian citizenship. One of them cut his veins during the attempt to convoy him. He was taken to the Russian a week ago directly from the hospital without medical support. The detainees who have already been taken out of Crimea report that they experienced pressure from the side of the management of prison to recognize themselves as citizens of Russia. Ukrainian citizens in Russia also are involved into the physical labor. One of them reported that he worked without holiday for 14 hours a day. For the first month, he received 20 packs of cigarettes. For more than 3 years, Ukraine had not been able to obtain information from Russia on the fate of more than 4,000 orphans who were in orphanage in Crimea at the time of occupation. It is known that in October of 2014, several children were taken from Crimea and moved to the families in Russian citizens. However, the Russian authorities refused to give Ukraine any information about the fate of moved children and those who remained in Crimea. Forced deportation from the Crimea are being also related to the local who did not receive Russian citizenship. The Crimea Human Rights Group demand from Russia's authorities to stop the practice of moving of Ukrainian citizens from the territory of Ukraine. We insist upon the transfer to the Ukrainian authorities of all Ukrainian citizens already deported from Crimea to Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Spain, to be followed by National Forum Ossetia Accuses. Spain, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed, moderator, Mr. Fisher, and thank you very much to the expert and the special representative for the introductory remarks to this session. Spain would share the remarks that have been made on our behalf by the European Union, but given the importance of the issue that we are discussing today and the efforts that we're making, particularly in the area of counter-trafficking of humans, we would like to make a couple of points, particularly with regard to our efforts over previous years to establish a normative framework for fighting human trafficking. The basic pillars of this framework are the integral plan against the trafficking of women and children for the purposes of sexual exploitation, and the protocol on the status of victims, and that has additional provisions relating to the particular case, special cases of minors. Now, these are recent standards trying to bring in the Palermo Convention and the commitments of the OSCE, as well as other legal instruments at the international level. So this plan has prioritized one thing which is key, which is awareness raising in government and administration, as well as promoting cooperation between civil society and the administration. There's also regular follow-up through annual reports. I think it's also worth noting that recently there have been instructions given to the law enforcement agencies and the military having closer contact with civil society. The growing specialization of the police in fighting trafficking has enabled very positive results in recent years and has certainly cut short the lives of criminal groups, which always have some kind of international structure, having two leaders, one in the country of origin and one in the destination country. And as a result, we've come to the conclusion that it's fundamentally important not only to carry out the fight at the national level, but also to pursue international cooperation in the OSCE, of course, and will continue contributing here, and in the UN. Last December, a resolution was adopted in the Security Council under the Spanish chairmanship, which was Resolution 2331, which is a landmark in this area of policy making. Thank you very much indeed.
The next speaker is the National Forum Ossetia Accuses, followed by Sandy Jan. National Forum Ossetia Accuses, you have the floor.
Thank you, moderator. My name is Alexei Sanago, and I represent a non-governmental organization from the Republic of South Ossetia. I would like to speak to the issue of refugees. Now, in the resolution submitted to the General Assembly of the United Nations by Georgia in 2017, there is a reference to the right given to all refugees to be able to return to their homes, in particular to Abkhazia and South Ossetia. But what is not mentioned is that the appearance of these refugees, the fact that they exist, is due, in fact, to the wars waged by Georgia against Abkhazia and South Ossetia. There are more than 100,000 Ossetians who became refugees, and nothing has been done to assist them in all of these years by the Georgian authorities. According to the last census of the USSR, there were 126,000 Ossetians living in Georgia, but at the present time, according to Georgian authorities themselves, there's only 20,000 Ossetians, and their number continues to fall. So South Ossetia believes that this problem needs to be resolved resolutely on the basis of international law and taking into consideration the realities in the region. There must be well-balanced decisions based on proper information, with Georgia, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia all participating in the negotiations. And it is only in Geneva that this can be done, where there are the meetings on peace and stability in that area. But the submission of such resolutions to Georgia to the General Assembly undermines the work in Geneva. If Georgia really wants to consider issues like refugees in the area in the General Assembly, then South Ossetia believes that it should become a member state of the United Nations and be able to participate in those negotiations together with Georgia. The full text will be made available in writing.
Karim Sos, Sandijan, you have the floor.
Здравствуйте, меня зовут
Sergei Tatev from South Ossetia. I'm representing the NGO Sandijan. Moderator, friends, one very important aspect of human rights is the right to say where you live. It's essential to be able to live one's life. In totalitarian regimes, this is undermined, and this is a situation we're seeing in Georgia with regard to Ossetians who suffer discrimination from the authorities. Their property is confiscated and they are removed from the ownership of small businesses which they built over years for them and their families. The discriminatory policy in Georgia has led to the ethnic cleansing of the Ossetians from Georgia, seeing a significant drop in the local population. Thousands of Ossetians have been moved forcibly beyond the borders of Georgia, being deprived of their property and becoming refugees. A lot of them are aged, and it's obviously the burden of having to relocate is huge stress on people who are somewhat aged, and obviously settling down in a new area is very difficult. So we would call on all those relevant to pay attention to this issue.
Is Karim Sos, to be followed by Georgia. Karim Sos, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, moderator. We would like to draw attention to the situation of Crimean Tatars in Crimea. And this is something that we have mentioned last week in plenary sessions. We've also mentioned this this morning. It's been mentioned by the US and the Ukrainian delegations. There is pressure put on groups that are not prepared to accept the occupation of Crimea. These people are disappearing. They are being charged on political grounds with trumped-up charges. And this is essentially forcing these individuals to leave Crimea and to move to other parts of Ukraine. There's a whole series of laws that bring this about. Just recently, a change was introduced into the Russian law on citizenship in accordance with which individuals accused of terrorism can be stripped of their citizenship. And the Crimean Tatars are often charged under that very article of terrorism. And for the time being, some 25,000 people have escaped from Crimea, from repression in Crimea to Ukraine. Those are the ones who are registered, but we estimate that there are at least 50,000 such internally displaced persons. And all in all, in Ukraine, there are more than 1.5 million internally displaced persons, and that's a very serious situation indeed. Providing them with accommodation and other public services is extremely difficult. In closing, I would just like to mention that the overall situation that we're seeing is that anyone identified as unloyal by the occupying authorities are repressed, and that essentially forces them to flee Crimea. Thank you for your attention.
Followed by the Center for Support of International Protection. Georgia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Georgia aligns itself to the statement made by Belgium on behalf of the EU and its member states, and in addition, I would like to make national remarks. I would like to update the distinguished colleagues on the situation of IDPs and alarming developments in the occupied territories of Georgia. Unfortunately, hundreds of thousands of IDPs and refugees expelled from Abkhazia and Tskhinvali regions of Georgia as a result of Russia's aggression against Georgia, the ongoing occupation of its territories, and the several waves of ethnic cleansing are still unable to return to their homes in safety and dignity. Humanitarian and human rights situation has extremely deteriorated due to the recent developments. Restriction of freedom of movement, prohibition of education in native language for the ethnic Georgians, the practice of illegal detentions along the occupation line, and kidnapping continue. The occupation regime in Sukhumi closed 4 so-called crossing points from the existing 6 points. This step further restricts freedom of movement of the local population and aggravates the situation on the ground. It has a very negative impact on vulnerable groups of population, in particular people in need of medical care and or medical evacuation, elderly, women with children, families divided by the occupation line, as well as school children who go to school on the territory controlled by the government of Georgia to get the education in native language. We are particularly concerned with intensified discrimination of ethnic Georgians in Abkhazia region. Just recently, the occupation regime in Sukhumi has started aggressive enforcement of issuance of residence permits in the Gali district, launching the implementation of the so-called law on foreign citizens. On the other hand, they are proposed to obtain the so-called Abkhazian passports on the condition that they deny the Georgian citizenship. It means that they are forced to become the stateless persons, as the so-called Abkhazian passports are null and void according to the international law. The above regulations envisage ethnically targeted violence and provide for additional restrictions for residence, work and exercising property rights by ethnic Georgians in Abkhazia region. This entire process can become a ground for another wave of ethnic cleansing. In this way, Moscow successfully manages to impede confidence building between war-torn communities and to succeed on Russification of entire Abkhazia region. Besides, ethnic Georgians residing in Gali, Tqarcheli and Ochamchira districts are forced to change their surnames and nationality into Abkhazian ones. The severe security and human rights situation on the ground once again underlines the urgent need of international monitoring missions, as well as establishing international security arrangements in both occupied regions of Georgia. We urge the international community to continue to push the Russian Federation to provide unrestricted access to the occupied regions of Georgia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Center for Support of International Protection, to be followed by Global Advocates. Center for Support of International Protection, you have the floor. Please turn on the microphone, yes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Moderator, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Milan Kadar-Mirsov, and I represent the Center for Support of International Protection from the Kyrgyz Republic. Over the last 3 years, our center has been cooperating with the OSCE office in Bishkek with a view to implementing the national program for combating trafficking in human beings. We seek to do this through a whole series of measures. In 2005, a special law regarding that was adopted for the protection of victims as well. And then there was a plan that was adopted for the period through 2011. And then a second plan covered 2012, 2016, and we now have a third one. And there is a list of bodies that have different competencies when it comes to combating trafficking. And there is a committee that answers to the president and that coordinates the activities. Unfortunately, it exists for the time being only on paper. So we need to have more effective implementation of that law to ensure combating of trafficking. A committee of parliament working closely with civil society put in place a working group to monitor and analyze how the law to combat trafficking is being implemented. And that resulted in a number of recommendations being made to render the combating of trafficking more effective. There are still a number of systematic issues that need to be resolved, and some practical and legislative measures are in place, but often they come in too late, and the coordination doesn't work very well. There are a lot of obstacles to the conduct of proper investigations, for instance. So we would call on the OSCE, ODIHR, and other interested parties to work closely with the Kyrgyz Republic to provide expertise and other support in order to enhance the effectiveness of the various national institutes that have been set up to combat trafficking in human beings. Thank you.
Azerbaijani community of Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan. Global Advocates, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, Tajikistan has already been mentioned numerous times during this conference for its systematic human rights abuses. Thus, let me just briefly introduce the problem of Tajik political refugees and asylum seekers who were denied entry to the EU member states, and in this particular case to Poland. Ziyovidin Salimov and Jama Sherov were working for a Turkey-based Payom.net, an independent Tajik news agency. Since its establishment in 2015, the agency has been frequently targeted by the Tajik authorities and its special services, including hacking attacks, getting Turkish authorities to seal the agency's office, and creating a fake website with an almost identical name in order to pose as Payom.net. Two other citizens of Tajikistan who were denied entry to Poland, Fathudin Mazitov and Mahmat Sobir Saigoziev, are members of dissident movements that oppose the Tajik regime. The former was a member of the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan, and the latter was the chairman of the Youth for the Rebirth of Tajikistan. Both movements were criminalized for their oppositional activities. Additionally, nearly 70-year-old Tajik citizen Kalandar Sadurdinov, one of the 5 founding members of the IRPT.
Please a reminder just of the topics of the sessions: refugees, displacement, and trafficking.
This is on Tajik refugees, Mr. Moderator. Let me finish. It has been more than half a year that the Tajik have been unable to cross the Polish-Ukrainian and Polish-Belarusian border. The dissenters were denied entry to Poland regardless of the fact that they sought international protection status. The denial was also accompanied by numerous breaks in procedure. According to the EU directive and the Geneva Convention, Poland and other EU member states have an obligation to conduct a fair procedure that would check the basis of the Tajiks' applications for international protection. Therefore, we ask the Polish authorities and other EU member states to reverse the decision to ban their entry to the country and allow them to apply for international protection status. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Azerbaijani community of Nagorno-Karabakh, to be followed by Anti-Slavery International. Azerbaijani community of Nagorno-Karabakh, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Zrovshan Zaev. I'm a member of the Azerbaijan community in Nagorno-Karabakh. Colleagues, all the members of my community were driven out in 1992. We were subject to ethnic cleansing accompanied by violence and force, weapons. So today, not one Azerbaijani lives on their traditional land. The land was occupied, and that's why there are now 1 million refugees. Today in Europe, this has become known as being a forcibly displaced person, so people are familiar with it, with that term. If we look at what we've heard today, there is still a threat of this happening again, because the occupying forces are on the contact line every day. Shots are fired, people die, and young officers of the Azerbaijani and Armenian army are killed. So the Azerbaijani community of Nagorno-Karabakh has been calling out for help for a long time. Again today, I would like to call on the OSCE to build a dialogue between the sides. In 2009, I was in my hometown in Nagorno-Karabakh, but it was a difficult situation because I knew that I only had a few hours there. So again, I would request that you do all you can to build dialogue between the sides. Thank you.
The next speaker is Anti-Slavery International, to be followed by Liechtenstein. Anti-Slavery International, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and thank you very much, Ambassador, for organizing this very important exchange this afternoon and for the significant effort and work that you have invested into this issue. We are very fortunate to have been part of the alliance ever since it has been started, and we will continue to support the work of you and your mandate. I'm particularly grateful for highlighting the need of multi-stakeholder and multilateral collaboration in addressing trafficking in human beings, and in fact also some of the issues that contribute to people's vulnerability to human trafficking and modern slavery, people who are displaced, people who are in the mood. It is extremely important that we are talking about this in this context. I would like to highlight in particular the indispensable role that civil society plays in efforts to counter trafficking, but also address the underlying vulnerabilities that lead people to be vulnerable to trafficking and modern slavery. It's not just civil society organizations acting as service providers. It's in particular civil society organizations that are around the table with policymakers discussing the most effective ways how to address modern slavery and human trafficking. And in fact, the ability of governments, businesses, and others to counter trafficking very much relies on the ability of civil society organizations and indeed individual human rights defenders to identify new trends, to disclose and document cases of trafficking and modern slavery, and be able to do so without risk of persecution. I'm grateful to the representative of the United States for reminding us about the situation in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan in relation to the cotton harvest, which actually is underway at the moment. And in fact, I would like to raise a concern over one particular case that relates to a Turkmen human rights defender, Mr. Gaspar Matalayev, who has been imprisoned over 10 months ago on what we believe are false charges for his activity documenting and publishing a report on use of state-sponsored forced labor in the cotton harvest. And a petition has been submitted to the president of Turkmenistan last week that had over 60,000 signatures globally pleading for Gaspar's release. I would like to stress just a final point is that the success of all of us in dealing with human trafficking very much depends on the ability of individuals like Gaspar to be able to operate without fear of persecution. And really what we wish to be a civil society organization is critical friends to governments and others to help deal with this issue.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Liechtenstein, to be followed by the Public Foundation Legal Clinic Dilet. Liechtenstein, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Liechtenstein is worried not only about the massive scale of human trafficking, but also about the disproportionate vulnerability of refugees and migrants, particularly women and children. Liechtenstein promotes cooperation of financial intelligence units and other authorities to share relevant data to detect and disrupt illicit financial flows associated with human trafficking and modern slavery. To that end, Liechtenstein published a report together with UN University containing 25 concrete recommendations on how to unlock financial chains associated with human trafficking and modern slavery. It is the outcome of a 2-day workshop in which experts discussed the nature of the exposure of the financial sectors to modern slavery, human trafficking, and forced labor, the risks associated with that exposure, and the measures it can take to combat these crimes. Liechtenstein stands ready to contribute its expertise in these areas within the OSCE process of combating human trafficking. In the context of the global refugee and migration crisis, Liechtenstein is committed to implement its international obligations and to support refugees as well as states hosting large numbers of refugees. On 1st January 2017, new asylum legislation entered into force in Liechtenstein with the purpose to accelerate the asylum procedures and reduce asylum applications from safe countries. It is important for asylum seekers to know as soon as possible if they are entitled to stay. The reform also strengthened the non-refoulement principle. Furthermore, asylum seekers in Liechtenstein enjoy full access to the labor market from the very first. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Public Foundation Legal Clinic Dilet, followed by the Legal Center for Women's Initiatives, Sana Sezim.
Thank you very much, moderator. My name is Timur Sultanov, and I represent the Public Foundation Legal Clinic Dilet in Kyrgyzstan, and our organization defends the rights of refugees. And in my statement, I would like to speak to the issue of providing long-term support to refugees from the legal point of view. In the Convention on the Status of Refugees, it is stated that ratifying states will support and facilitate assimilation and integration of refugees. At present, that article of the Convention is reflected in the law on citizenship of my country, and ordinarily people have to be residents for 5 years before receiving citizenship. In the case of refugees, 3 years is enough. But then there was a referendum in my country on introducing changes in the constitution, and one of those changes was to make it possible to deprive people of citizenship. And a new constitutional law has been drafted for the Kyrgyzstan Republic, in which this standard about how refugees can obtain citizenship has in fact been deleted. And the absence of this legal standard I believe means that the country is no longer fully in line with the Convention on Refugees. And I'd like to draw into some other legal aspects of the draft law being worked on citizenship, which can have some direct legal consequences, namely the way in which citizenship can be taken away. One of the criteria is representing to the national security, but a threat to national security is not something that is well defined in law or in the criminal code, and there is a fear that this can be used as a way of putting pressure on human rights defenders, independent media, and political opponents. And so, distinguished participants, this removal of citizenship law in the Republic is something that should be taken a hard look at. But in fact, this is removing citizenship is done by an extrajudicial commission, which is answerable to the president. It has not yet been constituted, but we very much fear what the future will bring there, and I think the pressure should be brought to bear on the government of the Republic to bring laws in line with international standards.
Followed by Belarus. Legal Center for Women's Initiative, Sana Sezim, you have the floor.
Добрый день, меня зовут
Khalid Chabsheva. I'm the leader of the NGO Sanazism, which is located in Kazakhstan. The structure of the national policy for many years has been to counter human trafficking in line with international standards. The trafficking of humans, and particularly of children, is the product of globalization and is not an exclusive phenomenon for our country. We have developed social services for victims. This is a big step, but we need to note that these standards relate to Kazakhstan citizens, and we cannot extend help to non-nationals. We are increasing the effective application of these standards. The trafficking and exploitation for labor is still a crime. We have figures which show that the official figures are less than the actual state. The identification of the crime of trafficking, given the specific characteristics, and in Kazakhstan we are ensuring that we can effectively identify and define the crime. There are a package of measures on human trafficking throughout the country. We are carrying out monitoring involving NGOs, and we need a uniform legal approach as well. We need a multifaceted legislative approach to make up for the any loopholes in the law, making sure we remove them and ensure that we have measures that work on a cross-cutting basis throughout government. Thank you.
The next speaker is Belarus, to be followed by Intersex Iceland. Belarus, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. At the outset, I would like to extend our thanks to our distinguished introducers for the insightful presentations. Indeed, the issue of trafficking persons, despite the efforts made to eradicate it, continues to be one of the biggest challenges of the 21st century, and continues to be in the focus of international and regional organizations. The UEC provides, in our view, a tangible contribution to the global efforts to prevent and combat trafficking in persons in all its forms, and we highly value the work of the OEC Special Representative and Coordinator on Combating Trafficking in Human Beings, Ambassador Madina Jarbusinova, and her able team, and stand ready to fully support her efforts. We fully support the concept of 4P, prevention, prosecution, protection, and partnerships, which is regarded as a key component to any national strategy in combating trafficking of human beings. And Belarus undertakes a great deal of efforts in this area. I'm not going to enumerate all of our efforts. I just mentioned that our national measures can be divided into four main areas. Improvement of existing legal basis, the capacity building of relevant law enforcement and structures, coordination of efforts of all national stakeholders, both governmental and non-governmental, in combating trafficking in human beings, and international cooperation. International cooperations is the key to developing partnerships. And in this regard, we are consistently working to advance the issue of combating trafficking in persons on the international agenda. As you are all aware of, literally next week on the 27th, 28th September, a high-level meeting of the UN General Assembly will be held at the United Nations to assess the implementation of the global plan of action to combat trafficking persons. In our view, the review should not only take stock of the progress achieved, but also address so-called emerging dimensions of human trafficking, which features, among others, human trafficking in conflict, human trafficking along new migration routes, human trafficking for forced labor, human trafficking supply chains, trafficking of children, human trafficking for the purpose of organ removal, and organ trafficking. And we are quite confident that the OSCE, as the member of Interagency Coordination Group against persons, can make a significant contribution to the success of the Global Plans Review, which is going to be the most crucial human trafficking event this year. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Intersex Iceland, to be followed by Austria. Intersex Iceland, you have the floor.
Intersex people in situations of displacement face particular risks and challenges. Intersex people are people who are born with variations in sex characteristics, that is, sex characteristics that do not fit standard definitions of male and female biologies. Primary sex characteristics are chromosomes, gonads, hormone production, and sensitivity to hormones, outer genitalia, and inner reproductive systems. Secondary sex characteristics are those that develop at puberty. Intersex people across the world face grave violations of their bodily autonomy and physical integrity. To normalize the appearance of intersex children, they routinely face surgical interventions at age. Interventions include, but are not limited to, cosmetic surgeries such as clitoral reduction, clitoral amputation, vaginoplasty, and phalloplasties in infant, which lead to severe physical impairments ranging from painful scar tissue, lack of sensation, and urethral issues. As the child grows, the scar tissue often breaks down, facilitating the need for further surgeries to repair the damage caused. Gonadectomies are performed on small children, leading to a lifetime dependency of hormone replacement therapy to prevent early onset osteoporosis. These violations lead to high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. In situations of displacement, intersex people are particularly vulnerable. They may have healthcare needs that are not being met in situations of displacement, such as access to specialized healthcare. Surgical interventions may be needed to repair damage caused by prior violations to ensure that person's continued ability to expel waste such as urine. In cases of gonadectomies, intersex people will need access to endocrinologists to maintain their hormone status to prevent long-term health problems such as osteoporosis. Hormone withdrawal can also lead to severe depression and anxiety. We recommend that all delegations of OSCE member states start training those working on the issue of displacement on the issues faced by intersex people in situations of displacement. To that end, we recommend that all member states liaise with national or regional intersex organizations to build up a knowledge base of the particular needs of our vulnerable community. We recommend that the OSCE start addressing intersex issues in all of their work on the issue of displacement.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Austria, to be followed by IOM. Austria, you have the floor.
Thank you, moderator. I will speak in German.
Austria fully supports the statement made by Belgium on behalf of the EU, and we'd like to add a few things in our national capacity. By way of introduction, I'd like to thank the introducers for the excellent presentations. The Austrian OSCE chairmanship has focused on prevention and countering of trafficking of humans as a priority. We've organized a number of events with different focuses, and the discussions at these events have enabled the exchange of good practice and experience, and in doing so enabled us to develop better methods for prevention and countering human trafficking. Furthermore, the countering of human trafficking in diplomatic budgets, trafficking of children, and human trafficking in the context of crisis situations is something that was focused on. It can only be addressed at the international level, and it's necessary to focus on countering the root causes. So it's essential to focus on partnerships between states, international fora, civil society, and the private sector. This is all key. And we also need a cross-cutting, interdisciplinary approach. That's essential. Austria has signed up for the battle against human trafficking, particularly with underneath our Foreign Office. We have ensured that all relevant ministries, the federal regions, the social partners, and non-governmental organizations work together. They have been guided to focus on the 4 Ps, coordinating their work around prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnership. Finally, we would like to invite anyone concerned to the 10th conference against human trafficking on 20th of October in Vienna. The conference will focus on the OSCE's work against human trafficking, particularly in the context of crisis situations. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the IOM, to be followed by the Foundation for Countering Digital Threats, Modern Slavery, Kidnapping and Exploitation. IOM, you have the floor.
Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, much effort has been made by the international community at large and individual governments to combat trafficking in human beings as a serious and complex crime. Legal frameworks that better protect those identified as victims of trafficking were created. Human trafficking is well integrated into the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, reflecting a continued political commitment to addressing the issues. IOM, for its part, has been working to curb this phenomenon since the mid-90s, and thus far has provided assistance to more than 85,000 women, men, girls, and boys victims of trafficking. Overall, IOM assists 1 in 7 survivors of trafficking identified worldwide. However, despite our and our partners' efforts, the number of people benefiting from protection remains small, certainly when compared with the millions who continue to be exploited. There is evidence of extensive networks of and traffickers spanning countries of origin, transit, and destination, and as IOM research indicates, there is high vulnerability to trafficking among the migrants trying to reach Europe. IOM's study addressing human trafficking and exploitation in times of crisis makes the forceful case that protecting migrants from trafficking and exploitation is a life-saving action and should be treated as such alongside traditional relief intervention. As a response to some of the experiences IOM had in emergencies, we developed the Migration Crisis Operational Framework in 2012, which is a practical, operational, and institution-wide tool to improve and systematize the way in which the IOM supports its member states and partners to better prepare for and respond to migration crisis. The framework intends also to address the protection gaps that we have identified in the current humanitarian response system, specifically regarding trafficking in human beings, and provide practical solutions to those gaps. Unfortunately, in the current context, we have seen a rise in anti-migrant sentiments, violence carried out against migrants, and measures being introduced that have only increased irregular migration and migrant vulnerability throughout the world. We must change the paradigm, and we can start by campaigning for a fundamental shift in public perception of migrants and migration. Our collective responsibility requires paying particular attention to those made vulnerable by a myriad of circumstances and conditions to ensure that their needs are properly identified and that they are provided with appropriate support and protection. IOM, as ever, stands ready to provide you with the support you may need and request. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. The next and final speaker on my list is the Foundation for Countering Digital Threats, Modern Slavery, Kidnapping and Exploitation, Nedopusti. You have the floor, the Foundation.
Thank you very much, Chair. To begin with, I would like to thank the ambassador for a wonderful conference organized by the office in Moscow on combating trafficking in human beings. And I mention this because in this union between business and government, there is a third leg or a third pillar, namely civil society. And let me tell you how Russian civil society contributes to combating trafficking. The situation is not easy for us, of course, because we have very limited resources, and many organizations are funded solely by private contributions. For instance, the Safe House Foundation a campaign to combat trafficking on the eve of the World Football Championship. It uses its own resources to save people from slavery in Dagestan. That's another NGO called There Is an Alternative. So there is work being done by people who simply believe in the cause. They're specialists, psychologists, lawyers, people for whom it is impossible to remain dispassionate in the face of trafficking. Nedopusti, we used was something that we did as an internet program to try to find lost children, and the internet is being used more and more as a way of trafficking in people in the first place, but it can also be used to find these people. There is an extraordinary digitization of trafficking in human beings. We have to understand this, and so we need to monitor this criminal activity in an unconventional way, differently than in the past. We need to look at the content of certain internet sites, identify the abusers. That's something that we try to do, and we're very active in this regard. And now, the social chamber of the Russian government has drawn attention to combating trafficking and has a number of recommendations coming out of its hearing in which civil society participated as to how this can be done effectively. And I hope those recommendations will be heard out by the decision makers. Thank you.
This was the last speaker on our speakers list. And before we move on to the final part of the session on the rights to reply, I would like to give the floor to our two speakers for any very short concluding remarks they may have. And again, with a reminder to all participants, to all delegations that would like to exercise the rights of reply, to let the colleagues behind me know. I will start, maybe we will reverse the order, and I will perhaps start giving the floor to Mr. Mohammed Ii for any final comments he may have. Mr. Mohammed Ii, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And giving the chance, I want to emphasize again on the role of civil society, not just providing assistance or services on the ground, as one colleague said here, and also as contributing at the policy level and making policies. It is very important. And also to not forget one issue that was not mentioned here, the issue of raising awareness. Raising awareness for trafficking and also being victims of trafficking, it is very important. And as I said in a side it is very important that most of the victims of the traffickers, and they don't know that they are victims, and they don't know about the trafficking, and they think that it is a normal process that they are going through. So raising awareness and trust building to these victims are very important, and that they are in front line, it is very important, their roles. And also I want to speak about psychological supports for victims of traffickers and torturers, and also cultural mediators, which is the important point. I'm from Greece. I see that how big problem is the issue of psychological support, and it is not just Greece, as I'm aware, then also in Italy and countries, some countries in Balkan, and it is a big problem, and there is the lack of psychological support to traffics and victims of tortures. And I'm very happy that today here, and I heard some voices for about asylum seekers from Turkey, from China, and also some from Crimea and also Ukraine. And as networks of refugees in Greece, we see the increasing of asylum seekers from Turkey and also from China, that they are not feeling safe in Turkey. I think that it is most of the time they are participating in our events, and they don't want to be photographed, and they are not feeling safe most of the time because of, I think, this economical power of the China. I don't know how it works, and it is obvious that it is increasing people in China seeking asylum in Greece that I see. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now the floor goes to Ambassador Jabusinova for her final comments. Ambassador Jabusinova, you have the floor.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank all the delegations and representatives of non-governmental organizations who took the floor and raised their concerns, informed about the measures undertaken in the fight against trafficking in human beings, and voiced the recommendations. And I was if I may say so, to realize that many of the recommendations actually prove the findings and recommendations made during our latest alliance conferences and the events organized by the office. And I'd like to thank Dr. Mohammed Ii for commenting the issues related to trafficking and the need for non-governmental organization not to be recognized as service providers, but also the need for them to be equally present during the decision making and the decision taking. It was once again here reiterated the need to better implement the legislation adopted in our participating states, and implement the commitments, international commitments and OC commitments or intentions agreed upon in the framework of our OC action plan and addendums. But it was also mentioned that there is a need to revise legislation and to join and adopt some new international instrument, new conventions in order to better protect people at risk and vulnerable people. Due to the time limit and constraint, of course, we couldn't address in our statements all the aspects related to the trafficking in human and maybe beyond the focus of my statement, there was an issue of the activities in my office to explore new trends in trafficking in order to discuss preventive measures. We are also, of course, paying attention to the techniques, as it was voiced by one of the participant today, techniques used by the traffickers. To my regret, we have to admit that traffickers are more creative, and we have to follow them. But not only the new techniques used by traffickers, and of course the need to follow money in order to better fight the impunity of traffickers. We are also planning to have a stronger focus on use of internet. It's both positive and negative aspects, and maybe to empower our participating states with the capacity through internet to identify and prevent trafficking, as well as track dirty money. I was already shown the sign about the need to respect the time. I just want to say that through this steady focus of current and incoming OC chairs, we will continue supporting our participating states in fight against trafficking in human beings till the end of the year. In addition to the conference already mentioned by the Austrian delegation, there will be the Human Dimension seminar where the issue of trafficking will be also addressed. And once again, I'm reiterating the readiness of my office to assist our participating states in our common fight, in close cooperation with our OC structures and international partners. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now have 9 delegations for the rights of reply, and I would kindly ask you, so that we can stick with the time, to try to speak within the limit of 1 minute. The first speaker on my list is France, to be followed by Italy. France, you have the floor.
Excuse me, moderator. Nous avons bien
took note of the concerns which were addressed by the NGO Church of Almighty God France, and these will be communicated to the relevant authorities. Requesting asylum in France is covered by the Office for the Protection of Refugees, and that comes under the of the interior. The decisions are subject to control by the National Court of Asylum, which comes under the Conseil d'État. Requests for asylum are considered on a case-by-case basis, taking into account the situation in the country of origin, and obviously appeals to any decisions are possible. Thank you.
Very much. The next speaker is Italy, to be followed by Greece. Italy, you have the floor.
Grazie, signor moderatore.
Thank you, moderator. I would like to take advantage of my right of reply to respond to the European Federation on Freedom of Conscience. The border police follows the standards covered by Regulation 399 of the European Union, generally speaking. That is what is applied when borders are crossed. The documentation set out in the Geneva Convention is accepted. So if there is some document that gives access to a Schengen country, or a travel document covered by the Strasbourg Agreement, then can enter. Now, the UK is not part of the Schengen area, and that has consequences not just for refugees, but also for all citizens who now need visas to go to a country of the Schengen area, and religion has nothing to do with this.
I would like to thank Ambassador Yabrusinova and her office for the excellent cooperation that they have with the Greek relevant authorities and the constant support. In addition, I would like to thank Mr. Mohammed Ii for sharing with us his experience in my country and underline the importance that Greece shows to his suggestion and his constructive criticism. I know, Mr. Mohammed Ii, that you have close cooperation with the Minister of Interior, and I'm very happy to have bilateral contacts with you. Greece, as one of the main entry points for most refugees and migrants reaching Europe, is very well aware of the challenges involved. We have put tremendous efforts and financial resources in saving thousands of lives, including in search and rescue operations at sea, and to receive them in a human way with the mobilization also of the local population. Greece, in the current challenges of the economic crisis, has as a main priority to fulfill its obligation regarding hotspots and reception capacity with international assistance, especially within UNHCR. Hotspots are fully operational. However, the refugee crisis, as Mr. Mohammed Ii pointed, surpasses the capacity of individual countries and has to be dealt with collectivity and in a coordinated manner. Only by dealing with the root causes, as you said, and following a holistic approach to address these phenomena will help us promote multilateral cooperation, enhance early identification procedures, and establish effective referral mechanisms. I will conclude as our national rapporteur underlines no country is immune, whether as a country of origin, transit, or destination. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Georgia, followed by Armenia. Georgia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and I would like to point out and kindly request you to call upon the participants while taking the floor to properly and accurately identify their country of origin when they choose to do so. Such country is Republic of South Ossetia. The region of South Ossetia is an integral part of Georgia, which is reaffirmed and recognized as by all participating states present here, the only exception being the Russian Federation, which continues to illegally occupy the territories of Georgia. Georgia does not oppose the participation of NGOs from its occupied regions, so long as this does not violate the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Georgia within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Armenia, followed by the United States of America. Armenia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'd like to exercise my right to reply to the distinguished colleague from Azerbaijan delegation. Indeed, I agree with the colleague that human rights cannot be ensured at the expense of the human rights of others. Regrettably, the inability of Azerbaijan delegation to engage in dialogue on human rights of people, all people affected by conflict, indicates that its concern is not genuine. It is not concerned by the human rights of displaced population, but with its conflict perceptions. If we believe official statistics of that country, the number of its displaced population of early 90s is constantly growing, which shows that in almost quarter of a century, this country has violated their human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the right to integration. The topic of IDPs is also constantly misused by Azerbaijan in international fora to justify a dire human rights situation in Azerbaijan and distract attention from criticism of human rights and fundamental freedoms of its own population. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the United States of America, followed by Azerbaijan. United States of America, you have the floor.
Thank you, moderator. The United States fully supports the territorial integrity of Georgia and its sovereignty within its internationally recognized borders. Our position on Abkhazia and South Ossetia is clear and consistent. These regions are integral parts of Georgia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Azerbaijan, followed by the Russian Federation. Azerbaijan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Due to the time limits, I will just point only a few points, and our whole statement will be circulated. Regarding my Armenian delegation's speculation about the violation of rights of residents in the occupied territories of Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh region of Azerbaijan, while mentioning these issues, Armenia delegation forgot to mention how it violates basic human rights and freedoms of Azerbaijans expelled from this region and other occupied territories by changing the demographic composition existing before the outbreak of the conflict through transferring Armenians into these territories and preventing the refugees to returning to their homes, along with the destruction and misappropriation of their property, exploitation of natural resources, and changing the historical and cultural character of the occupied territories. Such actions can in no way be consistent with human rights standards. Concerning the people of Nagorno-Karabakh region, unlike the Armenian sees it consists of two parts, which are the Azerbaijani and Armenian communities. One community expelled violently, and the second community still remains in these territories with arms. And human rights and fundamental freedoms of both communities shall be equally protected. But before that, some steps. In first place, a factor of Armenian military occupation from the conflict from the region should be removed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is the Russian Federation, followed by Ukraine. Russian Federation, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take the opportunity to reply to the representative of the US, Ukraine and Georgia. Once again, we note with regret that serious issues such as the fight with human trafficking have been used by delegations to achieve their individual aims and political discussions. With regard to the 2 million displaced persons in Ukraine, we agree. The result of the anti-terrorist operations carried out by the Kiev authorities has led to around 2 million people having to leave their homes in order to save their lives and those of their loved ones. Hundreds of thousands of one have been received by Russia. With regards to the statement by Ukraine, I would once again reaffirm that Crimea is a part of the Russian Federation. With regard to the situation in Donbass, we've commented on this many times in the past with regard to the root cause and the real situation in this region. Once again, we can only call on the Kiev authorities to stop violating the rights of their citizens. Thank you.
The next speaker is Ukraine, followed by Ukraine, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. We appreciate the information and recommendations of the representatives of the civil society from the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, Ukraine. The delegation of Ukraine attracts attention of the OEC Austrian chairmanship, ODIHR, and the special representative that the new for the OEC situation of occupation and attempted annexation of the territory of one OEC participating state by another participating state caused the new forms of trafficking as illegal displacement of prisoners, Ukrainian citizens from Crimean prisons to the territory of the Russian Federation, Ukrainian children from the Crimean and Sevastopol orphanages to Russia, and action of the occupation authorities that of Ukrainian citizens of different ethnic origin in occupied Crimea under the risk of displacement. This problem needs to be addressed with necessary efforts and resources. Some of this problem caused by illegal massive passportization of Ukrainian citizens by occupation authorities in Crimea and Sevastopol that is not recognized by the government of Ukraine and be identified by HDIM and as one of the contradicts to the international law. The representatives of Ministry of Interior of Ukraine and Ministry of Social Policy of Ukraine, who are the members of Ukrainian HDIM delegation, will bring to the capital the recommendation of NGOs concerning our country's internal procedures. I thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Poland, to be followed by Poland. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I would like to first reply to the Human Rights Without Borders representative. Poland, similar to other EU countries, doesn't have systemic solutions prohibiting North Korean workers, citizens or citizens of any other nationality to take up work in Poland. In view of the fact that a general ban on entering Poland and taking up work here for specific nationalities would be discriminating, we supported an introduction of systemic measures within the EU framework. The Polish government does not take an active part in the process of hiring North Korean workers, nor does it promote such practices. They are based on private companies' independent agreements, and according to our data, there are currently around 400 North Korean citizens working in Poland, and this number is systematically decreasing. It is important to stress that in 2017 and 2016, Poland did not issue any work visas to North Korean citizens, and the data by the Asian Center in Leiden that Mr. Fautre referred to concerns work permits issued by the district labor offices, and this data is publicly available. The government institutions oversee the employment conditions of the North Korean citizens and ensure that Polish laws are respected in their workplace. To that end, these institutions regularly inspect the companies where the North Korean workers are employed. Poland welcomed the UN resolutions 2371 and 2025 that Mr. Focze also referred to. Until those resolutions have been transposed into the EU and Polish legislation, issuing of the work permits for North Korean workers by the district labor offices has been put on hold. And I have two more replies.
We are running out of time, so one very final remark, but then please conclude really very, very quickly.
With regard to the case of Tajik nationals raised by the Open Dialogue Foundation, we would like to state that all asylum cases are reviewed on a case basis by the respective state authorities, and we would like to also inform that one of the measures that Poland recently introduced to support asylum seekers is a program to grant free professional lawyer support for people who applied for international protection. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now the here is Canada. Canada, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I won't keep people long. Just very briefly, we reiterate that we do not and will not recognize Russian claims over Crimea, and also to join my U.S. and Georgian colleagues that we do not recognize Russian claims over occupied territory in Georgia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of this working session. I would like, first of all, to thank our two introducers, Ambassador Jabusinova and Mr. Mohammadi, for their excellent introductions that led to a very rich discussions. I would also like to thank them for their concluding remarks. On a more personal note, I very much look forward to cooperating with the Office of Ambassador Jabusinova in our own ODR anti-trafficking work. I would like to thank all of you for your participation. Thank you to my ODR colleagues behind me at my side for their support in moderating this session. And finally, thank you to the interpreters for making communication possible, and to all of you for your patience as we went a little bit beyond the schedule. Thank you again, and this session is closed.